We are live.
Great. Welcome to the Planning Board meeting for September 2nd, 2020. I'll begin with roll call and then go through the agenda. Alden Clark.
Here.
Beth DeLeo.
Here.
Ann Gardner.
Here.
Tanya Hartford.
Here.
Liam McGavern is absent. Rick Tainter.
Here.
MJ Verde.
I am here, but I will be leaving by probably 8:45.
Okay.
Hope we all will be, MJ.
Yes, that would be great.
Don Walters.
Here.
Bonnie Sontag here. We also have Linda Guthrie, our note taker. And I believe from the planning office, we have Andy Port and Caitlin Sullivan. Anybody else? No.
That's correct. Thank you.
That looks right. Okay. So let me go through the agenda tonight. We have one change in the order of events. The first thing on our agenda is going to be the request for minor modification for the reserve at Bashaw Farm. Then we will have and that is not a public hearing, but then we will have one public hearing, Super Trust at 69 Parker Street, a special permit for use. And then our other business is an approval not required for 17A Harrison Street and 198 Water Street. Minor site plan review for Parker Street, which will be continued. Approval of the minutes from August 19th. Potential zoning amendments, we'll be discussing short-term rental units amendment and 6C amendment, both of which are just proposed. And then there'll be other updates from the chair or the planning director. So that's our agenda for tonight. Just a reminder for people who may be attending as members of the public, to access documents for any of the applications we're discussing tonight, you'll see the one that we would be discussing at the moment put on the screen by Director Port. All others are accessible from the city website. And note that when you get to them through the agenda, the most recent documents are at the bottom. And also a word about public comment. Tonight we have one public hearing which allows for public comment, and it will be announced at that time. If there's any other interest in a comment from the public, it's at our discretion whether or not we take it. But you can always raise your hand and Director Port will ask what the issue might be. Okay, that's it for administrative details. Let's open with the request for minor modification. The reserve at Bashaw Farm. Attorney Mead, are you here?
I am. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Lisa Mead, Telem and Costa on behalf of the Reserve at Bashaw Farm LLC. And just for orientation purposes to the board, this is the subdivision on the left, the first Colby Farm subdivision. And the lot we're speaking of is the last lot on the left. And this is a mere request to move the driveway from one side of the building to the other. Right now you see the plan that was approved and it has the driveway on the left side of the building. The house next door would like to put a deck on that side of their house. And so in order to provide a little more separation, we're requesting to move the driveway. And if you could show the next plan, Andy, to the right side of the building. We were before the Conservation Commission last night. They approved this modification. You'll see it goes up against the 25-foot wetland line, but then there's the proposed gravel pathway. So they're not particularly concerned about that. And the Conservation Commission approved this last night. So we'd request A, that the board determine this to be a minor modification, and B, that it approve the modification itself. Thank you.
And thank you. And just for the board's information, I was notified that in fact the Conservation Commission had approved it. So we have that officially from them. Are there any questions or comments? Then I'll take a motion to approve, to deem the request minor and approve the minor modification request.
So moved. Alden.
And a second?
Second, Ann.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor, and I will call the roll. Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
Yes.
Anne,
Yes.
Tanya,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. It is approved.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your indulgence of moving me on the agenda as well.
Not an issue. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Very much.
Right, so we will go to the public hearing for 69 Parker Street, special permit for use application. Attorney Griffin, are you here? Oh, well, that's a bit of a problem.
I am here.
Oh, you are here. Oh,
Just trying to
great.
unmute myself.
Oh, good. All right. Now that you're unmuted, tell us about this application.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I represent Barrett Cook, who's the manager of the Super Trust LLC. And as you can see up on the screen, the applicant submitted a site plan, shows existing and proposed parking. It also shows the proposed parking requirements, existing and proposed. First off, the application meets all zoning requirements, so the only real issue to be decided in this special permit for use, it is a special permit for the professional services use 416. The only real issue is, do we comply with the parking requirements? And so that's why we presented just this plan for your consideration. So for the existing conditions, the premises is located in the I-1B zoning district. It's got industrial and office uses in its vicinity. The existing building's a little over 14,000 square feet of gross floor area. The current tenant in the building is Ibarra Technologies. That tenant is a light manufacturing tenant, which is a by right use actually, and occupies a portion of the building. Does not even really come close to, needing the parking that's already there on site. They have more than sufficient parking. They only require 7 spaces. The site itself is very large. It's 2.37 acres. The existing parking spaces, that are already on the ground are 31. And so Ibarra is only using 7 of those 31, and the lot is already striped right now. And so you might note from the aerial photo and also from the parking site plan that there are 3 loading docks, which Ibarra uses in its business. And now the petitioner is looking to eventually lease portions of the building, if not the whole building, for professional services. However, until such time as that occurs, the petitioner does not want to inhibit Ibarra Technologies business, which requires those 3 loading docks. And as you can see on the site plan, right up where Andy's got the cursor, it says TBR Bay, TBR Bay, TBR Bay. Those are the 3 loading bays. Okay, so that brings us to the proposed plan. The proposed plan is to take the 31 existing spaces, remove 1, and then add 17 additional spaces. And we're doing this because if we compute the gross floor area and the parking requirement associated with use 416, we come up with a requirement for, I believe it's 48 spaces. And with the 1 parking space per 300 square feet of gross floor area, 48 would be our requirement. So we would need that additional 17 spaces that we propose. And in getting those spaces, we would have to remove the loading docks, the loading bays, and put parking spaces in front of them. So that's going to bring us to something of an odd condition that we're requesting in the event that the board will grant this permit. And so we've gone back and forth with the planning office to come up with something that will accommodate for that. And I put a special condition in my memorandum that I had submitted to the board. The planning office has supplemented that special condition with some additional language. There it is right on the screen. We don't have any problem with the supplemental language. So in the event that the planning board sees fit to grant this permit, we request that this condition be added to the permit, and that will allow the petitioner to only have to restripe the entire lot once the zoning requirements require the additional spaces, essentially. And so no occupancy permits or will be allowed until that is done. So we think that's a fair gatekeeping language. Now, with respect to the special permit criteria, I'll just go down those one by one. So the particular use proposed is a professional service use. Its existing building is going to remain. It'll comply in all respects with the use in the district and the dimensional requirements. The proposals to add new use within the building, not no alterations to the exterior, expansion or anything like that. And it'll conform to all the dimensional requirements in the I-1B zoning district. The use code for the new use would be use 416 professional services. It would be medical or dental services, but that is unknown at this point. The requested use is essential and desirable to the public convenience and welfare. Currently, there is a need for professional services in the city of Newburyport, which is not able to be accommodated in the downtown business district. As the board knows, the zoning ordinance has been amended to accommodate for that need, and such uses are now allowed in the business park by special permit in front of the planning board. The use will not create undue traffic congestion or unduly impair pedestrian safety. As I've mentioned, required parking will be provided as set forth above. No significant increase in traffic will occur from the establishment of the business. Trips to and from by customers are going to be intermittent throughout the day in the event that appointments are made with professionals inside the building, but it will not overload the feeder streets. The roads in the business park are not particularly heavily traveled with respect to commuters. They have heavy vehicles, sure, but not heavily traveled or trafficked, nor is there consistent pedestrian use. This use will not overload any public water drainage or sewer system or any other municipal system. There are no special regulations for this use set forth in the special permit table, and the use will not impair the integrity or character of the district and the adjoining districts, nor be detrimental to the health or welfare. It will not cause an excess of this use in the neighborhood, and it's in harmony with the purpose and intent of the zoning ordinance, as again, the I-1B does allow for use 416 by special permit, so it is certainly something that was the intent of the ordinance to allow, as long as all the criteria for such permit is met. It keeps with the plan to expand the constellation of business uses in the industrial park, or as we call it now, the business park, for more flexibility in finding, keeping, and keeping businesses in the city. And lastly, the use will comply with all building codes and will not emit any dangerous, objectionable, explosive, radioactive, or other hazard. That concludes my presentation for those reasons. Would respectfully request that you grant the special permit along with the special condition, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have right now. Thank you.
Good. Questions from any of the board members who would like to go first?
I have a question.
Yes,
I
Rick?
guess it's not so much a question as a comment. I appreciate the special condition that's being requested, but I would feel more comfortable if it were more specific. And what I mean by that is if we had a threshold of professional office space that kicked in the requirement to restripe the spaces. Looking at the site plan, it appears that since 14,322 square feet requires 48 spaces, then 32 spaces would represent 9,548. So I guess I'd feel comfortable if the requirement were something along the lines of the restriping of the parking lot to configure parking spaces should not be required to be undertaken until the professional service tenants have occupied at least 9,000 square feet of the floor area. Just if my math is correct, because
Rick,
the other way it just seems very vague.
Rick, this is Andy Port, Director of Planning. We had discussed this condition internally, Caitlin, myself, Jennifer, and obviously Mark Griffin working for the applicant. The way this condition is structured with the additional language, and that I think we have a similar concern, although we addressed it slightly differently. We suggested this additional language to make it clear that essentially beyond the space that they're getting occupancy for right now, they would not be able to get the occupancy for the additional professional social service space in the building, any additional space, unless the zoning administrator can verify that they've got adequate parking. So rather than specifying any particular threshold in here, what happens is when they come in for that occupancy permit for additional space in the building, the zoning administrator would have to confirm that there was additional parking for that portion of the building based on the additional area. So without needing to reference any specific threshold, this condition makes it clear. It really is specifying something that really already happens, what we do, but it makes it clear in the decision that they just can't occupy any additional portion of the building unless the zoning administrator can confirm that the number of spaces added is sufficient.
Okay, so just to clarify that, so this would mean that, in other words, they wouldn't be able to incrementally add parking spaces for a small amount. Once they got to where they were exceeded the 32 spaces, they'd have to go to the whole way and do the 48 spaces. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not written that way. And perhaps you might have a more particular concern about some particular threshold, but the way we had put this together was that this would allow the applicant essentially the flexibility to expand the professional social service space in the building from its proposed size, the initial portion of the building, up to and including the entire building, provided there's adequate parking on the site. So I guess maybe your concern is, you know, at the end of the day, the way this condition is written right now, with the additional language from the office, they would have to show at least the minimum number of spaces for that portion of the building on the site. So yes, that could technically mean that they could do part of the striping that's on that plan as opposed to the entire striping if they wanted to occupy a portion of the building. So perhaps that maybe that's where your concern lies, but they would not be able to get occupancy in the building for the remainder of the additional space unless there was adequate parking based on the square footage they're proposing to use at any future time.
Yeah, that was kind of my concern, is that we're approving a site plan here as part of this special permit granting action. But what you're saying is there might be a site plan that is neither the existing site plan nor the one that we're approving, that might exist for some indeterminate amount of time while the professional office space is growing. And I kind of feel uncomfortable with that, having a site plan that has not been approved by the board as part of this special permit.
Understood. I'll leave that to the board and the applicant. It's understandable, I guess, the concern. I don't know if, how that impacts the applicant, but certainly the condition could be modified to require it if there's any additional space beyond what's currently proposed.
Would it be possible, this is Bonnie, to incorporate into that some sort of staff review of interim site plans as they expand beyond the current use, that is then allowing them the occupancy, so that there's a documentation that backs up the condition that we see here and release of occupancy permits?
May I make a suggestion?
From the office's perspective, I would say that that's preferable. I think it's a more streamlined process for addressing the additional parking that would be needed, given that this is parking that's really just for the employees at the back there. That seems like it'd be a more streamlined process than coming back to the board with a interim plan or whatnot, but I'll defer to you.
We actually think that once we reach the existing parking threshold, we're going to restripe the whole lot anyway. So language to that effect would be satisfactory for the applicant if the board could see their way through on that.
Okay. I see now Rick's nodding his head. Are you in agreement then with the interim site plan to accompany?
Oh, I didn't think that was what Mark was saying. I thought he was saying that they would jump from the existing to the proposed.
But yeah,
Yes.
but I think as a catch-all, in case that doesn't happen, there's no problem in adding to this condition interim site plan to reflect, partial, what do you want to call it, expansion to the point where this site plan then kicks in.
We won't need those spaces until we reach the threshold.
Exactly.
So if you were to have a provision in there that allowed the planning director to administratively approve an interim site plan and have that site plan on file in the planning department at any point, then I would be happy with that. I just didn't want to have a plan that had no record of having been approved.
Okay, let's add that to the condition, Andy, and I'll double check that before I sign it.
Understood. That works fine.
Any other concerns?
This is MJ. I just have a question. As they start doing these renovations, does it kick off the need to add the sidewalks? I mean, I know it's based on a certain percentage of the cost of renovations, but is this the place that gets brought up?
Are you talking about site plan review conditions?
Not exactly.
We're not in
Yeah, there's a trees and sidewalks.
the street trees and sidewalk ordinance.
Yes. So yeah, that is a threshold. I don't know what the proposed value is for the improvements in the building.
Well, I think it's listed as like 50,000 as the kickoff, and I imagine there'll be quite a bit more than that if they're putting in medical and dental offices. And I just see this as one of those places where
It's just to be clear, it's either a residential unit, which isn't applied here, or 50% of the assessed value of the building is my recollection.
Oh, 50% of the, okay.
Yeah.
And does, this is Bonnie, is that also, is that separate from site plan review as MJ is suggesting now? Because this is not eligible, this won't have to go to site plan review.
It is actually a requirement that the ZBA and the planning board integrate any requirements for sidewalks and trees, pending feedback from the Department of Public Services, if the applicant is tripping either of those thresholds.
Okay.
So in this instance, the question would be, is the applicant tripping that threshold?
And do we have that information, or are we making an assumption here?
Caitlin, do you know, was that issue looked at? We know we have our boilerplate language that can be put in the decision to address it as a condition, but do you know if that issue was looked at?
Yeah, we have the standard boilerplate condition that is in all of our decisions. The tree and sidewalk ordinance is triggered about 50% of a substantial rehab of the property. It does not appear that this would be 50% of the value of the property, although I'd ask Mark for his thoughts on that.
Well, we don't really know what we're going to do for renovations at this point because we don't have a tenant identified.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Andy. I guess the synopsis, I guess, with that, the way that things work in the ordinance and the way that the board's approval process works, I think what makes sense here is to use the boilerplate condition that we use for these projects when it's not currently clear what the valuation is for the improvements, because that's the 50% threshold. What we would do is something we've done with the ZBA more frequently and the planning board a little bit less frequently in the last year or two, is to put a special condition, it's boilerplate, that says if the applicant, when they go in for their building permits, is tripping that threshold that's required by the ordinance, then they are obligated to do improvements for sidewalks and trees based on feedback from the Department of Public Services. So in that scenario, I would expect there to be a sidewalk along the front of the property if that was the case. And then some discussion of where trees would go based on feedback from the Department of Public Services, consideration of utility locations and whatnot.
Andy, for clarification, I heard you say a special permit after Caitlin confirmed that this is part of the standard conditions. Is there a separate special permit, special condition in this case, or
no? Sorry, it's the standard condition, but the reason I say special is because it's only projects that are triggering that threshold that we even put them in. We don't bother to put that special condition or that standard condition into projects that are clearly not adding a residential unit or clearly are minor in nature and not tripping the 50% threshold, just to not confuse applicants or anyone else.
Yeah. Okay, so it is included from what Caitlin said.
Correct.
And it will be reviewed. It's an automatic review as they come in for building permits.
That's correct, because what happens is the zoning administrator, before signing off on either the building permits or the occupancy, whatever is going on, would look at that condition and the decision and would ask them to close that loop before signing off on it. So in effect, what would happen is we would communicate with Jamie Tucolo, who's the Deputy Director of Public Services, and they would go out to the site. We'd have a confirmation of the nature of the improvements. And I think you all know that there's a sidewalk on from the Boston Way side further down towards the Route 1 traffic circle. And we've had discussions about a sidewalk going into the business park here. So I imagine that that's where this would fit in here.
Okay, MJ, thank you for bringing that up. Is that clear how it's going to be handled?
Yes, thank you.
This is a follow-up. So in many cases where it was clear that there was 50%, the 50% threshold was triggered, the sidewalk would be part of a site plan, but it's not here. So this assumes, I mean, I guess it's implicit, that at some point the applicant might be required to actually engineer and design and construct a sidewalk, even though it's not shown on the site plan right now. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if Rick, if your concern is at all that you'd like to see those improvements and review them, certainly that condition, that bullet plate condition, could be modified to require that the applicant return to show that information and get approval from the board as well for those details. If that's, I'm not sure if that's what you're.
No, I just want to understand who does the design. Pays for the construction. So it would be handled through DPS with the applicant paying for design and construction.
No, I'll defer to DPS, but the way that typically works is that the applicant would be required both to design the plans, get the approval from the Department of Public Services for those improvements, and we'd obviously be involved with the review of that to make sure it made sense. And then those improvements would also have to be constructed directly by the developer, rather than paying the Department of Public Services.
Yep.
Can I just ask a question going back to the parking issue? But
sure.
Is this typical to kind of take this iterative approach to providing required parking?
That's a great question. It's not typically done this way because usually there's a little bit more clarity. What we were trying to do here, and again, we defer to the board how you want to handle it, but recognizing, it became apparent to me as I was talking with Caitlin and Jennifer about this application that the applicant was looking to permit a portion of the building for a professional social services now, but also was hoping to essentially secure the right to expand that in the rest of the building. And that was apparent from the condition that was proposed by the applicant. So what we tried to do was add that additional language to make it clear, because the office has no objection to approving essentially two things at once. One is the use going there. We have no objection to the professional social service use there at all. And as far as the parking requirements, which is the site constraint that needs to be addressed, we felt that it was reasonable for the applicant to be able to show that they presently meet the parking requirements for the portion of the building that they need. And in the future, to be able to do that they would essentially trip that threshold where they'd have to build those or stripe those additional spaces in lieu of the loading bay areas that are at the back there that are being used. So what we were trying to do is essentially streamline the process, because we figured at the end of the day, you'd be back in the same situation. The applicant would be back in the same situation. You'd ultimately be approving a plan like this anyway. It seemed to make sense to try to allow both of those things to be reflected clearly in one decision, so that the property owner would be able to fluctuate the amount of professional social service versus the other uses allowed in the district by right, without having to continually come back to the board every time they're modifying that situation. But it try to summarize what we were trying to do there.
Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, so if they were to do a portion of the building professional services and keep the current use, would they technically have enough spaces? So
the building itself would obviously be subdivided in a different way, right? So we'd see.
Yeah, and is that typical, I guess?
It does happen in the business park. There are a few other places in the city, although to a limited degree. So this does happen in the business park for various different uses that are allowed as of right. I'm not sure if I can recall off the top of my head seeing it for a special permit use, but it does happen all the time for as of right uses. And they effectively have to just show again that if they're adjusting those demising walls and reallocating space, they have to demonstrate the parking requirements are met. In this case, in the recent years, we actually have a zoning administrator who does that as opposed to relying upon the building commissioner to check on those things. But yes, in effect, that happens on a regular basis, I would say more particularly in the business park than anywhere else.
Okay. I'm just wondering if, in order to not set some precedent that we're not going to want to follow, if we should maybe add some language about it being unique circumstances or something to that effect, given, I mean, you know, in looking at it and not understanding that they were using the loading docks the way that they were, I didn't understand really what the issue was. But now that you know, it was pointed out that they need to keep those spaces clear, I just wonder if it's worth putting some language in.
Yeah, we could, I mean, maybe perhaps for clarification, we could add in that condition, just clarification that based on the applicant's, the expectation the applicant has of fluctuating that professional social service use in the building, that this condition is meant to accommodate that. And the board finds that reasonable in this particular circumstance. Is that what you're?
Yeah, I'd be more comfortable with something like that. With some language.
Good. That's another addition.
We have no objection to that condition.
Okay. Anything else?
I have a question or comment. Number one, going back to the standard conditions that will be included in the special permit. I don't have them in front of me, Andy. Sorry. But is there a section in there that says before that building permit is issued, they're going to take a look at the uses, and in turn, if there is incremental water and wastewater, especially you had mentioned to us that it's possible that the water and or wastewater facilities are reaching some limit. What is the process used to protect the city that somehow there is a use that, you know, increases those services?
Well, actually, I don't want to speak for the water or sewer divisions, but I'm pretty sure that the capacity won't be an issue. The limitation we had, you might recall from some years back, we had in the business park was there wasn't a sewer lift station with capacity. That was replaced a couple of years ago with a MassWorks grant we applied for. And so now the capacity in the business park is enough there to hold, I think it's 1 million square feet of additional space they included, just to be sure. So in the business park. So the bottom line, I guess, is I would not expect there to be any capacity issues there, you know, based on the fluctuation of uses in this building, of uses that are allowed as of right in the business park. I think that's certainly a discussion we need to have as a city about our water supply and build out capacity. But I don't think that water or sewer are limitations here based on my communications with public services.
Okay, and Andy, just to be sure that you understand what I'm referring to, I'm not necessarily referring to the infrastructure adjacent or in proximity to the business park. But again, I thought I heard you at our last meeting say that there are some studies being performed because some people, entities within the city are concerned that our water and wastewater overall, i.e. the water treatment plants and or the wastewater treatment plant, may be reaching capacity. And the way I had inferred what you said is that it was a bit unexpected. And I may have misunderstood you.
No, I understand where the confusion comes from. No, it's a good question. The bottom line, I guess, is that the water department is doing another assessment of the water resources of the city, trying to make sure that they're best protected. And as part of that, we were having some discussions about build out because I want to make sure that whether the staff there changes over time or not, we have a good idea as to where that build out is. I think the build out concern really comes from the residential side of growth as opposed to the business park uses. And that's where there's some sensitivity to, for instance, if we're adding more accessory units or we're having, a build out in the Waterfront West area or the 40R Smart Growth District, we were trying to make sure, and we want to continue to make sure there's enough capacity there. But I have never heard concerns from the Public Services Division, water sewer, about any uses in the business park being a concern there. It's really the residential growth that I think that would drive that concern that we would hit our cap.
Okay, thanks. And the second part of my question or comment, when do we, and I first of all understand that there is zero incremental impervious surface we're adding. However, because we're going, a special permit is being issued, when does the clock reset with respect to taking a look at current regulations, i.e. how do we know that the stormwater regulations, if this was a brand new facility, are the stormwater regulations, the current ones, do they have to be followed? Do the actual runoff, et cetera, be followed versus when this was done X number of years ago? So is there such a thing as a cutoff point? I don't know. So it's really a question to you. Or
yeah, the stormwater regulations don't have that as a trigger really, so it's not the fluctuation of the uses in the building. If the real trigger for stormwater adjustments would actually be the site improvements themselves. So we don't really have that issue here, although it's a good question. We don't have a concern about that somehow, for instance, you might be deferring a stormwater review you'd want to have later on. The parking area isn't being adjusted. The amount of surface area that collects stormwater isn't changing, so there isn't a trigger there for the stormwater review.
Thanks. That would have been my assumption too, but thanks for validating that.
Okay, anybody else? So we have the draft decision and the potential findings have been listed there, and Attorney Griffin went through them. We've had a chance to review them, so they're pretty straightforward. Don, you have a question.
Excuse me, do we just have to, I may have getting the process wrong, do we need to open for public comment or?
Thank you very much. You are very good at watching that for me. Thank you. Yeah, you know I was going to go into the decision. Let me stop and open for public comment. If anyone would like to speak, please state your name and give us your comments within 2 minutes. And Andy, if you electronically raise your hand, Andy will let you in.
I'll just give a moment for that. I don't expect, based on our attendance, to have a pretty limited attendance this evening. It doesn't look like anyone's raising their hand, so I'll assume that there aren't any interested parties.
Okay, then I'll close public comment just mention again that the potential findings in the draft decision are consistent with what Attorney Griffin went through on the findings or the criteria for the special permit. Unless somebody would like to highlight any one of them for further discussion, we can move on to the motion. All right, I'll ask for a motion to approve the special permit for use in accordance with the draft decision and the amended special conditions that we discussed this evening. I have a motion?
This is MJ, so moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second, Rick.
Okay, any further discussion? I'll take a vote for approval. I have, yeah. Alden?
Yes.
Beth? Beth?
I think we lost her.
Oh.
Yeah, it looks like she might have lost a connection.
Okay, well, we still have enough people to vote. So we'll put her in as an abstention. Anne?
Yes.
Tanya?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
MJ?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. So you have your approval. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Under other business, we have an approval not required for 17A Harrison Street and 198 Water Street. And is Mr. Donovan here to present that?
Yes, Mr. Donovan, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep. I think, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. I am present, thank you.
You may go ahead.
Okay, so this is a first for me, so I'm not exactly sure of the formal process, and the surveyor is he's on vacation. So essentially what we're looking to do here is acquire the property directly behind my property and house, which is the 17A property. And the parcel is identified as parcel A. So it's a small piece of property that abuts directly our backyard from our neighbor, Betsy Woodman, who is the 198, I think is the address, Water Street?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just looking for approval and going through the process as I understand it. Again, this is a first for me, so I'm happy to answer any questions or get as descriptive as required or desired.
Andy, this is Andy Port. The office reviewed this A&R plan. This is pretty typical of approval not required plans where essentially someone's shifting a lot line at the rear of a yard, swapping some yard space or whatnot, and there aren't any problems created by this plan because there aren't any structures or setbacks or things going on back there. It's sort of a vacant parcel at the back portion there. So this is essentially just land being added to an adjacent lot from a very large parcel.
Good. Does anyone have any questions, Rick?
Yeah, Andy, you may be able to best answer this, or Mr. Donovan, I'm not sure who. It was a confusing plan to me because of the existing lot. Is the existing lot like a condominium or something like that because, with the dashed line going through it? Or is it actually a real lot? When you look at the plan, it looks like parcel A is being attached to both 17A and 17B, but that's not what the application or the plan says. It says it's only being attached to 17A. So it's,
yeah.
I don't understand that.
Yep. Yeah, let me describe, the dynamic here. So this is a condominium, 2 units, 17A and 17B, and connected by a very small line, about a 10-foot wall. If you look at the 2 structures, you may see that almost in the middle part. Mm-hmm. There we go. And the property behind the land, that is all part of 17A, my unit. And so the land that we're talking about now is directly behind and attached to that property.
So let's go back to the site plan because that's, again, it's confusing to me. It does look like the parcel A is overlapping both 17A and 17B, according to the way the plan is written. But I also don't know if it's possible legally, and Andy, you'll have to answer this, if it's possible legally to attach parcel A to part of a parcel and not to the whole parcel.
So do you mean to the whole,
so
the whole condominium parcel?
Well, no, I was actually asking Andy for this.
I think Andy is muted, Rick.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. My apologies. Thank you, Ann.
There's one lot which has both 17A and 17B in it, according to the way I may be wrong. When I look at my map, the aerial map, it shows it as a single lot. When I look at it here, it's not clear whether it's a single lot with 2 condominium units or 2 separate lots. If it's 2 separate lots, I can see attaching A to 17A. But if it's one lot, I don't think you can do what the plan says it's doing.
Yeah, we had read this plan as a single lot with a condominium association on it. That's essentially how it, so you see the dark line type on the outside.
Right.
So the surveyor has used that line type to indicate that that's the full lot that's in question that parcel A is being added to.
So
I think
the other owner should be listed on the plan, shouldn't they? Shouldn't Furno Trust be listed on the plan since it's being attached to their property as well?
Yeah, are you able to speak to, Mr. Donovan, are you able to speak to the ownership?
Yeah, I'm the president of the condo association. And so there's approval, there's 2 of us as members, and there's approval to go forward with this.
Right. No, I'm not questioning that. I'm just questioning whether this plan is an appropriate plan because it says it's doing one thing, which is attaching it to 17A. But in fact, I think it's attaching it to 17A and 17B. And how you work that out internally in the condominium is not really a matter for us, I don't think, so much. But I think this is yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe I'm missing something, Rick. I think there's some confusion because really what's happening here is that the A&R plan, that the portion of the sketch plan that's next to the detailed meets and bounds is a little sketch plan of the larger lot that the Woodmans own.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the 17A and 17B are listed in there and shown as essentially the sub portions that the assessors are keeping track of, right, for the condominium portion. But in reality, it's, I think, the opposite situation as far as the lot. So essentially, it is one singular lot, and the parcel A is being added to that. There happens to be a condo arrangement on that lot. And unfortunately, there's some confusion created by 17B and 17A being shown on that that other sketch there. Maybe I think that's where maybe the confusion is coming from.
Well, it's also the owners of record is incomplete, and note 1 is inaccurate. So, as far as I can tell,
note 1. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, Mr. Donovan, are you able to speak to that? It does look like perhaps it should be listed as. Yeah, I see that the notation only makes reference to 17A and does not make reference to the entire parcel. Perhaps that's a little bit misleading or confusing.
and also, again, the Furnos should be listed. The Furno Trust should be listed as one of the owners, I think.
Yeah,
or the
I would agree with
association, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with what the comment that Rick has made. I think at the end of the day, obviously this conveyance is not going to work properly unless all the parties are agreeing to it. Obviously, this plan is just going to be referenced with a conveyance. But Mr. Donovan, is there, Rick, I don't know if you're referring to, you're looking for a plan revision or that and some sort of signed concurrence of the other property owner or other condo owner.
I would be, I don't know whether it's possible to do this, but I would be comfortable voting to approve this subject to the plan being revised and corrected.
I would suggest that the matter be carried to another meeting where the proper plan could be voted on at that time, as opposed to a condition for an A&R.
Yeah, I think I agree with that as well. It's not a big deal to do it, and clearly the surveyor has to be brought back in. But it is an A&R, and they're pretty straightforward, and we should probably have it all clean when we do approve it.
So, Mr. Donovan, do you want to speak to the surveyor about adjusting the plan and reflecting the note accordingly, or?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure how he would reply. Unfortunately, he's not on this call. I do appreciate, that suggestion, Rick, to see if we could get approval, and I could turn around and update, immediately in terms of the two items that you discussed.
So we could put it on our next meeting agenda, September 16th.
Yeah, I think if that plan could be turned around in a week, which shouldn't take that long, I wouldn't think, if they could just get to the computer, then we could take it on the next agenda and have it endorsed at that meeting, just 2 weeks later.
Okay.
So could I have a motion to just continue it, right, Andy?
Yeah, Mr. Donovan, does that time frame work for you?
Certainly. That's the next meeting, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Correct. Yep.
I would make that motion to continue it to the next meeting.
And could I have a second?
Tanya, I'd second it.
Who's that? Tanya?
Yes.
Okay. Any further discussion?
One quick question just for Donovan. I was just curious why the parcel A wasn't set up to align with the lot lines.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it basically has to do with trees that have been planted by Betsy Woodman that she just wants to maintain on her property. So that was as simple as that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any further discussion? Then I'll take a motion to approve the continuance to September 16th by roll call. Alden?
Yes.
Beth? Is she still dropped?
Nope, I came back. Sorry about that.
Yay! Okay, Beth. Were you able to hear enough of this to vote?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so your vote is yes, right?
Yes.
Okay. Anne?
Yes.
Tanya?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
MJ?
I think I need to abstain because I dropped out as well. And so I didn't hear the bulk of
Okay.
the conversation.
Thank you. Don?
Yes.
Okay, and Bonnie, yes. So we'll see you back here on September 16th with a revised plan and all the proper documentation that goes with that. Thank you, Mr. Donovan.
Okay, thank you all.
Okay. All right. Minor site plan review for 0 Parker Street. We have a request to continue to September 16th. May I have a motion to that effect, please?
This is
So
Tanya. I
moved.
move.
Alden.
Oh. All right, Alden can move it and I'll second it.
Okay.
Great. Any discussion? I'll call roll for approval or to move it. Alden?
Yes.
Beth?
Yes.
Anne?
Yes.
Tanya?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
MJ?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
And Bonnie, yes. Okay, that seems to be all of our, well, we do have other business. We still are in other business. So those are all the applications, unless I've missed something. It looks, that's it. Okay. So we have the minutes from August 19th. Rick and Don and I have made some minor edits in it, nothing so substantive. So I'm going to ask for approval of minutes.
One question before we do that.
We'll have discussion. So I was going to open it for discussion. Okay. Is this about the minutes?
To approve?
Yes.
Okay. Don, motion to approve. Second, please.
Second.
And now discussion. Alden.
Yeah, I just wondered if Rick made the correction to his comment. I think it's just a typo where it referenced the zones B1, B2, and so forth. It says B2 twice in the minutes.
I didn't catch that.
Okay, it's about 2/3 of the way in when you were.
Alden, could you just highlight that for Linda and send her a quickie note tomorrow morning so she has that and knows exactly what you're talking about?
Okay, sure.
And Linda's copied on the minutes, so you'll have her email address.
Yes, I have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
This is Tanya. Linda, I have a couple of minor comments. I'll send them over to you, just clarifications on some things, but nothing major to discuss.
Okay, and you're sure these aren't changing any of the sense of it that we need to know about?
No, it's basically just taking out some repetitive, like just some language.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cleaning it up, which is, yeah.
Just cleaning it up. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, and that's what I meant earlier about Don and Rick and I.
I should have sent them, I should have sent them in advance, but I just read them.
It's just, yeah, I just want to make sure that we're not letting anything slip through that isn't discussed in a public forum.
Yep, no, it was just a couple of clarifications on the zoning discussion.
Okay.
Bonnie?
Yes, Linda.
If Alden will just tell me what page number it is, he doesn't have to send me an email.
Do you know, Alden? You're muted.
Yes. Yeah, I viewed it online, and so it's just one constant stream of consciousness. I don't have the page numbers.
Oh, all right. That's all I need in your email is the page number. I noted what it is I'm looking for.
Okay. Like I said, it was about 2/3 of the way down, but I'll send that to you. That's fine.
All right.
Great. Any other edits for the minutes? Okay, I'll go through roll call for approval. Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
I wasn't there, so I
abstain.
abstain.
Anne,
Abstain, I wasn't there.
Tanya,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. Good. All right. We're at the potential zoning amendments discussion. And it's time to go back and look at short-term rentals. From the joint public hearing, we had some differences of opinion with what's been proposed and need to discuss those for ourselves to see where our consensus is. I just want to say before we get started that any discussion and our recommendations that come out of tonight will have to be reviewed in the joint public hearing on, when is this, October 7th, just to make sure that everything stays within the public realm. So if you even have the slightest idea about something that you might want to comment on after this meeting, I suggest you put it into the public record during the meeting so that everything stays in the public realm. To get us started, I don't know if this is going to be helpful, but there are just 3 sort of guidelines to think about trying to stick up with as to how we get through all of this. First of all, we're focusing on the zoning amendment, even though we know the licensing amendment has information in it that is helpful in thinking about the zoning. So for those pieces of information that we may want to discuss in light of zoning, certainly we can bring them up from licensing. But the details of the licensing amendment will be handled in a public hearing by the licensing commission. The licensing city council committee and the licensing commission. That's not our area of interest. But as I say, anything from that would influence our discussion and ultimate recommendations for the zoning would be relevant. I'm going to suggest that we look at definition of uses, where we want those uses to be allowed, and thirdly, what to include in the zoning ordinance. Now we can go in any order you want, but I think those are the 3 main areas that we need to cover, but I don't want to hamstring anybody, so I'm just going to open it up and see where it goes.
Bonnie, I'd like to throw something out first, and I believe your second item, I think, which was where it would be, I would suggest being first as compared to what I consider some of the more granular items I think that Rick had raised with respect to definitions, et cetera, and perhaps specifically, I know the one item that was raised by several members of this board and perhaps the city council was, are we in agreement that we carve out Plum Island? I think that was raised by several of us. If I'm mistaken, I'm sorry. And then secondly was the item, and again, I do think, Rick, you raised this, as well as others, that there was a lot of public, or at least the people that commented, were generally not in favor of having STRUs in residential areas. And I think we said we would perhaps discuss that as well. But I kind of think in some, we talked about policy. To me, those are some of the big key items as compared to later on getting into some of the specifics of the language, which is, of course, important as well. So that's my suggestion.
Good point. Good point. I was just thinking in terms of where we want it might be differentiated by the type of rental unit that's being discussed, but we can back into that if we need to. So I think this is a good idea. Let's start with Plum Island, because that was a policy, I guess, decision with the counselors that it's so unique, and it has a history there, as Rick and others pointed out, that they just wanted to put that to the side and keep it in licensing alone. Is there any reason to mention it from anybody's point of view in the zoning?
Well, actually, I do think that we need to, because the way it's in the zoning by default. We have this table that Andy is showing us right now that basically says any type of short-term rental unit is allowable in any of those districts where it says P. And I think this gets to, what Don was referring to in some sense. Do we want all of those types of units in all of those districts? I don't know, Andy, whether you feel comfortable sharing what I sent you in terms of my breakdown of different things. I looked at it very carefully and had some concerns about the different types of short-term rental units. And I really, as I said at the public hearing, I really felt that we should treat home shares differently than limited shares and differently than Plum Island. There's also a problem, which is, I guess I still have that other problem, which is that there are things that the licensing ordinance is trying to do that can only be done by zoning. And so there are things that I would like to bring into the zoning ordinance that really need to be there, like parking. Parking has to be in zoning, it can't be in the licensing, really, per se. So, but I did have a breakdown. I thought we should do that, but there you go. This was a sort of a suggestion I had. My idea was that home share rental units are the least intrusive. They're basically saying, I'm going to go away on vacation, let somebody else live in my house for a month. And so they could be allowed pretty much anywhere, any residential district as of right. I wouldn't have a problem with that. Limited share and owner adjacent units are different because they involve bringing more people into a neighborhood. The owner is still there and we're bringing more people in for shorter periods of time. And there can be multiple unrelated people at that time. So that's where I thought we should be thinking about a special permit. And then Plum Island rental, I created a new use called Plum Island rental unit that would only be allowed in the Plum Island overlay district. And that's basically, the difference there is that it doesn't have to be the principal residence of an owner. It can be investor owned. So, and that seems to be just maintaining the status quo. So that was my suggestion. I know that Councilor Eigerman felt that this was adding too much into the zoning ordinance, but I do feel that these are different uses. And
this is Andy. I kind of agree with what Rick is saying here. I have no objection to this particular amendment. I think it makes sense. I don't know where Councilor Eigerman will fall, but I like the idea because I think there's an argument to be made that there's a zoning component if you're trying to make an exception within the limited area of Plum Island, but that limitation isn't clear, entirely. I think this is a good way of handling that, is having essentially one major category, which is short-term rental units, and then subcategories for that reference in the zoning. So I'm fine with that if that's the way they want to go.
So I think this is a good place to stop and just ask whether other members of the board feel that this is a good way to regulate things and whether this is going to address any of the concerns that were raised by some of the residents.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think a breakdown is appropriate here because of the different uses. And just a quick comment, you mentioned that, the Plum Island overlay is mentioned in the zoning ordinance that was presented to us already. So I think it is involved in the zoning already as well. But I agree.
Who would be the special permit granting authority?
Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, that's top of my list. Who's going to do all this? And not only that, are we going to?
Well, let's start there.
Okay. All right. Well, just start who and then how.
Depending upon who is, we don't care about the how.
Yeah. What I meant the how is, do we want to have just use the broad categories under the special permit findings that we have already in the ordinance, or do we want to add in addition to that to help this special permit granting authority, may the force be with them, to do this?
So
this is Andy. If I could just add a comment for your consideration before you have that deliberation. The support that I would offer for this adjustment is the fact that it provides all clarification for all those sub-uses essentially in the table. I just wanted to clarify for the record, I'm not necessarily in agreement that there needs to be a special permit in addition to a license. That's something for you to discuss with the council, but one thing to consider is the additional process that would be involved with two different boards, two different, nights of hearings, different, considerations they might have and whether or not there's any conflict there. So just keep in mind that you're essentially having someone for a short-term rental unit within those categories going to two different entities or agencies of the city for approval.
So, I'm a big fan of short-term rental units. Use them all the time. I think putting a special permit layer on for those two variations on it, it's over-regulating it, is what I think.
I agree.
I tend to.
Can we have one person who's that mumbling about something?
Oh, sorry, this was Tanya. I just said I agree with Ann. I would not agree to have a special permit for these uses. And I think what you're going to do is you're basically going to encourage more illegal rentals, because who's going to enforce it?
Yeah, and I was going to raise the point, so Rick, you think that the home share is less controversial, but I think a lot of comments were about noise and nobody is there to see what these people are doing. And with the home share rental unit, some people seemed more troubled with that than you might be with an owner adjacent or limited share where the owner is there to oversee what's going on.
So the one thing that I looking through this, and again, it's a point I made at the last meeting, there's an overlap between some of these short-term rentals and bed and breakfast and lodging houses. And many of these short-term rental units are going to fall under our definition of lodging house, the way we have it in our ordinance. So they will be, even though it says special permit for, say, a owner adjacent residential unit, if that owner adjacent residential unit had more than three people not related to the owner, it would be prohibited in all those districts. So that's a conflict we have to work out. So the special permit here, I see as being more permissive than the existing regulation, which would prohibit them as a lodging house. Similarly with the bed and breakfast, the bed and breakfast is not allowed in an R1 or R2, and a bed and breakfast allows up to 5 rented rooms. A limited share rental unit allows up to 3 rented rooms, and that says special permit. So it seems to me, even though it says special permit here, it's really going to be prohibited if it has 4 or 5 rented rooms.
But can we overrule? Can we?
You can, but
by special permit say that there can be a lodging house where it wouldn't otherwise be allowed?
You certainly could. You'd have to write that into the ordinance. You'd have to say that even though the ordinance says lodging houses are not allowed in R2, we're going to allow lodging houses if they are
so it would be both
licensed as limited share rental units. But
I listened to the tape of the meeting and your discussion with Jared about this point, and I don't think I reached any conclusion in my mind based on that discussion. So maybe mixing this up with lodging houses and such is more than what we should be looking at right now. Or maybe it's different, or as Jared said, the judge would say it's a lodging house. I don't know. It seems to be very, very complicated.
My concern is if we say it's allowed in this table and it turns out not to be allowed because of some other portion of the table, we're really not doing anybody any favors.
Yeah, I don't think, to Ann's point, as well as backing up with Rick saying, I reread that note in the minutes, and I don't think Jared actually realized what he was saying, because he said you have to meet both criteria in if there's an overlap in the given district. So the lodging house not being permitted would basically say, and you can't have that any kind of short-term rental there either. So it automatically knocks it out. So if we went with the proposal as it is currently, not this one, where it's permitted in residential areas, districts, not allowing a lodging house under the current definition would wipe it out. So there's a conflict there. I'm just wondering if it's too much to ask to change the definition of a lodging house and a bed and breakfast, to adapt it so that we could make the table consistent for those uses that would then, and I don't know what I'm really saying here, but would then allow by right where we want to have short-term rental units and try to avoid special permits for short-term rental units.
Bonnie, so I think you're saying you want to try to update the definition so that there's no overlap between the short-term rental units and the lodging house and bed and breakfast, for example.
Yeah, and where they're allowed, so that if there's going to be a special permit, it has to do with the lodging house and the bed and breakfast.
Yeah,
and then we get to the condition where several people have already said we don't want any special permits for short-term rentals.
Right. A question connected with that, I don't know if this will help clarify, but is there a license required for bed and breakfasts and for lodging houses separately?
Yes.
I assumed that was the case. And what happens if a bed and breakfast all of a sudden becomes a lodging house because of who they rented to, and they don't have a lodging house rent license? Is that something that's, I mean, what happens there?
I almost think the lodging house is almost an obsolete use in our table, because we're not going to have lodging houses. They're going to be inns, they're going to be bed and breakfasts.
Is that where, you know, when you come in for an executive transfer, like Market Street used to do that. I don't know what they're called, but they're longer than short-term, but shorter than a year contract. Is that a lodging house contract? Does anybody know?
A lodging house is based on solely, I think, on the number of unrelated people who can stay there.
Yeah, the definition says 5 or more people, not within the second degree of kinship with the proprietor or the person overseeing the lodging house.
And oddly enough, in the state law, it's 4 or more people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at that now.
So that there are things that require sprinklers as lodging houses because they meet the state definition, even though they don't meet the local definition.
Yeah, so we're fighting some definitions that are inconsistent to begin with, and then we're trying to layer on top of that short-term rental units. And then if we layer on top of that certain types of short-term rental units with a special permit, it's inconceivably complex.
So my solution, my partial solution to that is to avoid the question altogether. And Andy, if you could go back to my sheet, I just want to point out something there. I came up with the definitions in the licensing ordinance are very, very precise, and they have all these other things in it. Here, I came up with other definitions, and I excluded any consideration of the number of people who live there. I just said this is, either the owner is the owner's principal residence, or it's not, and the owner is physically present, or it's not. It's a much looser set of definitions, and it avoids this conflict with the zoning definitions of lodging house and bed and breakfast. And then that can be dealt with in the licensing agreement. I mean, the licensing ordinance.
What a simple solution.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make it, less complicated.
So Rick, would you recommend then changing the definition of lodging house in conjunction with this, or are we stuck because it's a state
Well,
definition?
I think we can't change the definition of lodging house, but we could change the use table.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah,
for
okay.
lodging houses, I guess. But I think that's a bigger question, and I know that that's probably being discussed as part of the comprehensive zoning rewrite. So I don't want to get into that, and I know Jared didn't want to get into that either. He wanted to try to focus this as tightly as possible. So I thought if we just didn't talk about the number of residents in the zoning, then we wouldn't have to worry so much about it, and could finesse it by being a little bit more general than the licensing ordinance is. The licensing ordinance is where all the regulation is going to happen. It's not going to happen here in the zoning ordinance.
So question building on this idea, would you recommend that we put these definitions into the zoning amendment and leave the licensing definitions to whatever the licensing folks decide to do with it?
Exactly.
So Rick, under licensing as proposed now, they could limit the number of bedrooms, whereas you wouldn't put that language here.
I wouldn't put
Is that
that.
what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Right. So just to be clear, yeah. So these definitions would be added to the 5E table 1.
Yes, exactly.
And the use table there would be a section in the use table with what you had outlined.
In numerical order, right? Yeah.
Right.
I'm not. This is Tanya. I'm not really following why we need to specify the different type of rental unit. I'm not quite understanding and following the logic of how this helps, and why does it matter?
Isn't it because where we allow it, whether in the residential areas or not?
Yeah, it's if you want to treat things differently. If you want to say everything's permitted everywhere, then you don't need to do that.
Yeah, and I think I would opt to say that, because I think that the problems you're going to have, it's not going to matter. You're going to have problems one with the other, and where you're going to regulate that is in the licensing, because there just might be a problem, a person who rents out their house who has problems, and then you need to take away their license. But I don't think it matters sort of whether it's in a residential district or whether it's in a R3 district. You're still, a problem person is going to be a problem person. You may actually have a single family home, that rents out their whole home, or rents out parts of it, or rents out a unit in their garage and has no problems. Nobody would even know that it's happening. So I think that it's almost overcomplicating it, I guess.
See, I was trying to be more permissive than the existing situation. Right now, as I said before, bed and breakfasts are prohibited in many residential districts. And I would like to either permit them or allow them by special permit in those districts. So that's, I'm trying to get at that and say, I think, right now, there might be many things that are limited share, that are technically limited share rental units, but they might be called a bed and breakfast, and you can't put them anywhere in a residential district. So I was trying to be more permissive than our existing ordinance, I guess.
Yeah, I like to keep in mind that the licensing ordinance is the one that really controls the behavior, and that we are looking at zoning. And that I'm going with the idea that I think we should have some broad definitions of these categories in the zoning, because as someone mentioned at the joint public hearing, when you go in for a zoning ordinance application, a zoning application first, you should know from a zoning point of view what is allowed. And without any definitions in there, even as broad as these are, I think the applicant is going to get confused, and then they're going to have to get into the nitty-gritty of the licensing agreement, just trying to sort out whether or not they can meet the zoning requirements.
Yeah, I agree, Bonnie. It was Juliet Walker that brought that up, and I agree. I think you need some amount of specifics in the zoning so that they have an idea of what's allowed or not before they go further.
Yeah. So Tanya, that's kind of why I like this as a starting point for people. Obviously, they're going to have to go into a lot more details with the licensing. And I'm with you about how people are going on about all the problems that are going to come up and so on. The licensing will take care of that and the requirements in there. The bigger question is about having one of these types of short-term rentals in a residential neighborhood being seen as a business. And I think that is a hurdle that we have to help members of the public get over or get around or come to learn to live with if we're going to go with permitted across at least all the residential districts. So does anyone have any comments on that? Do you think it's an issue? I mean,
Bonnie, I'll throw something out. At one point, I thought there was a discussion also on time, and I think perhaps it may be in the licensing, I don't know. I was just focusing on the zoning, but you know, to your point, I do think there's a difference between someone having a short-term rental unit for 3 months out of the year, whether it's consecutively 13 weeks or something, versus basically full-time in there. To me, there is a difference, and the difference is not the intensity; it's the intensity multiplied by the time.
That's true, because if you had a bed and breakfast or even a lodging house, you're trying to keep it open all year round as a business. What if we just put in the definitions, like we looked at a definition for a lodging house and said it doesn't include a fraternity? Well, how about we say here, it doesn't include a bed and breakfast?
Yeah, I think if there's a way to distinguish.
And then forget the whole special permit, because I don't think we should get into that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think with the license provisions, if they, they can only do it so many days out of the year and they need to live in town. I think people are concerned that people are going to come and buy all these properties and just Airbnb them as investments. And
yeah, and I think if you want to operate a year-round B&B, you're not going to want the restrictions of the short-term.
Right. So there's something different.
The different business model.
Right. We're talking about different things. And so if we can incorporate the differences into the definitions so that they don't overlap.
Yeah. But how does the bed and breakfast not overlap with what we have in the zoning? Seems to me it's quite an overlap.
Well, I see it very differently because they're not limited to a certain number of days in the year. So, it's their choice. You want to be a B&B or do you want to be a short-term rental? And if you're going to be a short-term rental, you can't do it for that many days of the year.
Right. Where are they defined, Andy? The bed and breakfast and the...
Yeah, I'll pull that up. That's in the zoning ordinance. I'll flip to that.
In 5E, there's a table 1, 5E. But it says bed and breakfast is just owner occupied up to 4 rooms without separate cooking facilities, and it can have common cooking. And sounds like a short-term rental could be up to 4 rooms, not have separate cooking facilities, and probably has a common kitchen. So it sounds very similar.
But the short-term rental limits the number of days you can offer that to the public.
Not all of them.
No, it's only the amount of person can stay.
There's no limit. If you had a limited share rental unit, you can do that every single day of the year.
Well, I guess that's what I'm saying. I guess, I'm sorry, Alden, you want to speak first? Go ahead.
I just said at a bed and breakfast, you could have that throughout the year as well, right?
Right.
So again, out of ignorance, my understanding was this was a B&B, whatever a B&B means, and I don't know the specific definition in our zoning ordinance, guys. To me, there is a different set of regulations. And it would seem to me, and I may be mistaken, but if we're having the short-term rental units, to me, I differentiate it. And I think the main differentiation I would put is the amount of time. So if it's, forget about it, it's 4 bedrooms, whatever you all just said, but it's 365 days a year, I would think you have to follow another set of regulations. Now, if you all are telling me, Alden and Rick and Andy, that there are no different set of regulations in the zoning, then I'm really confused.
Does it only come up in licensing? I don't see anything in the zoning part.
No, it's not in the zoning. The licensing limits, I believe it limits the home share units, but it doesn't limit
Just the home share that it limits.
That's right.
Doesn't limit the limited share or the owner adjacent units in terms of how many days a year they can do it. So it really, a limited share unit is 3/5 of a bed and breakfast. You could have if you had a 3, if you wanted to live in your house and rent out 3 rooms, it could either be a bed and breakfast or a limited share rental unit. They're both, it applies to both of them.
So could we define it as, I mean, if somebody rents it out more than a certain number of days, then they constitute a bed and breakfast or a lodging house?
Well, that's already covered. With the rental unit, you can't rent for more than 32 days or whatever the number is for all of them.
Right, but out of the year, if you're...
Oh, but out of the year, absolutely. Those other 2, the limited share and owner adjacent, are not limited to the number of days in the year.
But if
it just
there was something that said if
have to live there.
Does it more than 183 days?
No, that was about residency. So it has to prove
whatever it was
that you're a resident and that you're living there so many days out of the year.
Right.
But it wasn't about, you could still live there and rent out as one of the limited share or owner adjacent. Say I live in my house and the garage is rented out all year round on 32-day rotating cycles at the worst, at the best case scenario, because there are only 12 renters in the whole year and I've got a full house.
Yeah, I'm saying if there's like a threshold number that we can say, if you're doing it this much, then you're just an Airbnb. And if you're doing it more than that, then you need to be a bed and breakfast or a lodging house. And you are restricted where you can do that.
Yeah. Rick, do you remember from our subcommittee meeting with these guys, if there was a reason why we agreed to limited share and owner adjacent being not restricted over the whole year?
No, I think they wanted to leave it as open as possible. And most of these things are available all the time.
All year, yeah.
This is Andy. I just wanted to make a comment. One of the concerns I had with the zoning and licensing provisions for short-term rental units from the start, and I think I still have that concern, is the level of how complicated this becomes to regulate, to determine where someone fits in the regulations, monitoring, enforcement, and so forth. I realize that some of that will be done by the licensing commission, but there hasn't really yet been an acknowledgement that the licensing commission will need some more staffing to do all the processing of things outside of any online vendor that they might use for paperwork. So bottom line, I guess, is that whatever regulations the planning board and city council decide to adopt for short-term rental units, I think ideally it would be as simple as it needs to, as can be done. And 2, whatever the provisions are and whatever you're debating in the regulations that go forward, that there be clarity as to what is the problem that we are solving as compared to what is going on today in the neighborhoods. Is there a specific issue we're addressing, and does the language we're putting in address that?
So Andy, that raises a really good point, which is there any purpose at all in distinguishing a limited share rental unit from an owner adjacent rental unit? They're both situations where the owner is going to be present all the time and he's renting out something on his property, whether it's a room in his house or a garage or a second house on the property. So it almost seems like there's one way to simplify it is to get rid of those 2 distinctions. and say, you know, you can, as long as the owner is living there, you've got one set of regulations, which is combination of limited share and owner adjacent. And if the owner isn't living there at the time, then it's a home share rental unit. That would be a good way to simplify it. And then we could change the definition. We could change the use requirements for bed and breakfasts.
One question, sort of related. Is there a definition for owner occupied?
Yes.
As applied to bed and breakfast, as opposed to what was outlined in section 3 of the proposed ordinance?
Bed and breakfast does not require, I believe, owner occupancy, does it?
It does. In the definition, it says owner occupied.
It's probably not defined.
Yeah, I didn't find a definition anywhere in the definition list, but in the proposed ordinance, you know, it talks about, you know, a person being there at least, 183 days has to be, they have to reside there no fewer than 183 days. And I didn't know if that was the definition of owner occupied as it applied to bed and breakfast.
That's the state regulation for residency.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it has to do with bed and breakfast.
Yeah, just that the definition of bed and breakfast says it's owner occupied. So does that mean that they reside there, or?
Yeah, it is.
Or in a building
they're there
on
for a month?
premises.
Yeah.
Pardon me? Is that?
They have to be in the building or in a building on the premises, or.
Yeah, it assumes that it's their predominant place of residence.
Their primary residence? Yeah. Okay.
And that they're actually living there while they're renting it out.
I was just going to say the same thing, Rick. That's what that was my confusion. And
so here's there's another way to deal with this conflict, is to treat a limited share rental unit as a small B&B. So you'd have two classes of B&Bs, a 1 to 3 bedroom and a 4 and 5 bedroom. And the 4, just change the definition of bed and breakfast to be not up to 5, but to be only 4 or 5.
The current definition is up to 4, is what I read.
For bed and breakfast?
Yeah, for bed and breakfast.
Sorry, my confusion then.
It says up to 4, not including the owner occupied room.
And it said less than 5, yeah.
Okay, my mistake.
Yeah.
So then in that case, a bed and breakfast would be something where you're renting out four bedrooms, where a limited share unit is you're renting out 1, 2, or 3 bedrooms.
I think that's what it's meant to be, even in the current version.
But it doesn't say that, though. It's
less than 4. It's 3 or 6 unrelated people, right?
Right. No, that is true for limited. But I'm just saying that right now, a bed and breakfast that also includes a bed and breakfast. So if we exempted all the small bed and breakfasts from the definition of bed and breakfast, and had it only apply, it seems silly to make it only apply to 5 to 4 rented rooms instead of 1 to 4.
Yeah, and I was concerned as if in one of the situations you rented a room as a single and all of a sudden rented it as a double, all of a sudden you change your category.
Yeah.
You had multiple rooms rented as doubles as opposed to singles because of the number of people.
Yeah.
So I'm a little confused on those numbers. We aren't assuming that every one of the rooms that's listed for a short-term rental can only be rented to 2 people.
It says up to 3 rented rooms, up to 6 guests. So I guess that's.
Yeah, I think it's incorporated in there already.
Right.
You can't change. That's the short-term rental. That controls the numbers right there.
But if you had 4 rooms rented, so if you had 3 rooms rented and up to 6 guests, currently you're both a short-term rental unit and a bed and breakfast.
And potentially a lodging house.
And a lodging house, you're all 3.
And you're not allowed to have it in certain residential districts because that's the more restrictive zoning.
Andy, do you have a table showing where B&Bs are permitted?
Yeah, I'll pull that up for you.
Okay, thank you. and also lodging? I think maybe we should change definitions so that they're unique.
Yeah, the difference between
Short-term rentals are absolutely not these other things. Okay.
yeah, the contrast between bed and breakfast and lodging houses is bed and breakfast is permitted in B2 and B3, and the lodging requires a special permit there. Or lodging houses, it's not permitted in the marine district and multiple usage, and the B&B requires a special permit there.
And for all of, just to reiterate what I said earlier, right now, for all of those districts where a special permit or not permitted for a bed and breakfast, to use that as an example, I'm assuming you wouldn't be able to have a short-term rental unit. So it throws out everything that we're talking about putting in as allowed for a short-term rental.
Yeah.
Why didn't we think of this earlier when we were looking at it? Well, thank goodness for, you know, for this round of review, because we didn't really bring this in.
Or, I mean, if
We just didn't get this that far in the discussion.
Yeah. Eddie, do you know if we have any lodging houses in the city?
I was muted. No, I do not know. We could check and get back to you.
I'm just wondering whether we need that line at all.
Yeah, or just say they're not allowed.
could we put something in somewhere that says where there's conflict between the short-term rental unit provision and the lodging house provision or the bed and breakfast provision, that the Airbnb provision, the short-term rental unit conditions prevail?
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's the opposite of the usual rule, but it could be an exception. We could say, you know,
and do we want to do that?
There's probably a general statement in the ordinance somewhere, there usually is, that says where there's a conflict between regulations, the stricter one applies. But we could actually put something in here saying, notwithstanding anything else in the zoning ordinance or in state law, if this conflicts with anything else, the short-term rental, that would actually be a huge help.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. And you know, whatever debate there might have been had about what Councilor Agaman said at the last meeting, he's correct that you know, if there's multiple requirements in the ordinance, the party involved is going to have to meet all those requirements in order to, you know, to do whatever they want to do. So.
And basically that means they can't do it if it's stricter as in not permitted.
Right. So you might want to put in some,
certain districts.
you know,
yeah, so this solves that problem if we can make that new rule. I'm wondering how many other problems it solves.
Well, so I think we need to resolve the basic question that we started with, which is, where do we want to have these allowed? You know, and do we want to have them allowed everywhere, or do we want to have them allowed in certain zoning districts and not others?
Well, the one that came up that you pointed out in something I read, and we weren't able to answer that night because we didn't remember it correctly, is the conservation district. There's there are no accessory or secondary buildings allowed there. So that should probably go back to not permitted.
Well, you could still do a...
I'm in conservation with a single family home. Why shouldn't I?
You could do a home share, and you could do a limited share, but you couldn't
do an adjacent one.
You couldn't do an owner adjacent one, right?
So would an applicant, okay, let's just take that example. Would an applicant come in and say, but it's permitted unless we differentiate the three different kinds?
That's what I'm afraid of.
Right.
I'm sorry, why can't you do an owner adjacent in the conservation? Just because they're not allowed? Or?
You can't have two dwelling units in the conservation.
Okay. So you could do a room share or a house share. So you could rent a room in your house.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So that's allowed.
The other area I noticed was in the waterfront marine dependent area. You have not permitted in the short-term rental here, but it's a by special permit for bed and breakfast. And I would think that would be more appropriate on the short-term rental as well. I know there is a bed and breakfast in one of those areas not far from where I live. And I would think that instead of not permitted, it would be special permit there.
Are you sure it's WMD?
At least according to the zoning map I looked at this afternoon. The area between the tannery and Joppa is designated that way. So there's the houses along the on Water Street.
Yeah.
And there is a bed and breakfast there. So that is a WMD area.
On that side of the street?
On the river side of Water Street, exactly.
Oh, it is Riverside, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think in general, we were thinking that that should be limited to marine dependent.
Right.
Just say it wasn't, because there were so few residential.
Yeah. Right, they're not too many,
already.
but there is the strip along there between Joppa and the tannery.
So we're gonna put somebody out of business.
Well, potentially, or
body,
they have a special permit for bed.
Hey, it's illegal, right? It's illegal right now anyway. So, or it's not, it's, so we're not putting anybody out of business who's legally in business.
Presumably the bed and breakfast has a special permit already.
I think what Alvin's saying is right now it has a special permit, and the way the zoning was proposed, it was prohibited.
Right, and so I was wondering if it should be a special permit for the short-term rental as well, instead of saying not permitted.
I could live with one district. If we don't get too many special permits in this short-term rental business, I could live with one or two, but I just don't want to see them all over the place.
Right. I don't know how you can qualify that, Bonnie. I mean, we can hope for something, but candidly, that's not a strategy or a policy, I think.
No, but I mean, when we make a recommendation, we have to back it up with why. And so if we had a special permit in WMD, for example, just to use that one, because we're discussing it right now, we'd say that it would affect a relatively small number of residential residential units, because people have to live in them in order to make them short-term rental. That we don't think that would be a burden for a permit granting authority.
Gotcha.
I still think we need to separate out the bed and breakfast from the short-term rental unit somehow. I don't think what I suggested before, I think if somebody wants to be a bed and breakfast, then have we taken away their ability to be a bed and breakfast? If we're saying this trumps, if this is more stringent, say in this WMD district, where a bed and breakfast could have a special permit in that district, then what I suggested before would say that they can't have a bed and breakfast there. Even if we'd like to allow a bed and breakfast, but we don't want to allow a short-term rental unit. I feel like there's something different between a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental unit.
Well, I just
don't know what it is.
Again, it's the problem with the bed and breakfast regulation. So right now, if you're in the R1 or R2 district, you're not allowed to have a bed and breakfast where you rent out 3 rooms or 2 or 3 rooms. And with this proposal, we're changing, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we're changing the policy to say it's no longer not permitted, it's now permitted. We've just made that jump from not permitted to permitted without even going through a special permit process. So it seems to me it's a big policy change. And if we want to do that, we probably should just change address the bed and breakfast at the same time and make them permitted as well. Especially if the only difference is 1 bedroom.
It's not going to fly. That's a business. We're already pushing the envelope
But
with
there's no
short-term
difference.
rentals.
There's no difference.
Unless we update the definition.
If the same house could either be classified as a limited share rental unit or a bed and breakfast, then there's no difference. So you're basically saying we're actually changing the rules to allow bed and breakfasts where they're not allowed now. And I don't, I'm not saying it's bad, good or bad. I'm just saying that's what we're doing and we shouldn't ignore it.
Well, are there different licensing requirements for the bed and breakfast? Do they need to have some sort of, I don't know, are they corporations? Can somebody just say they're a bed and breakfast?
Bed and breakfasts are usually a couple who are renting out a couple of rooms in their house. I mean, that's been my experience.
Right.
One thing that would help here to differentiate them is an idea somebody came up with before, and I've forgotten why we haven't taken it more seriously, is to limit the number of days in a year that you can have short-term rental units of any kind in your house. And that would clearly differentiate it from a business, a bed and breakfast. Did we decide that wasn't doable for some reason and I've forgotten?
Well, I don't know why we would want to be that restrictive. And I also don't know why you're so concerned about calling short-term rentals a business. It is a form of a business.
Yeah.
And I'd like us all to remember, do you remember the very first public hearing on short-term rentals several years ago at the senior center? Probably 150 people came. And I would say the vast majority of comments were very positive. And the people, the operators, I mean, they're part of the fabric of the community. They really want to do the right thing. I think they provide a great service. So I just don't want to get too restrictive in any way. I think somebody should figure out how to make the definitions of bed and breakfast and short-term rentals different enough to reflect the different purposes they have. I'm also concerned that we are kind of circling around on this a lot. And if Councilor President Eigerman is just going to dismiss the whole thing, then we're not going to get anywhere anyway. So I would suggest somebody, and maybe that's you, Andy, talk with Jared about the planning board's big concern about this, and does he see any way to maybe alter definitions or whatever?
Actually, that's a good question, Ann. And I had a quick email exchange with Rick earlier today, but my thinking is that Rick has raised this concern. I think some of this concern was raised at the last meeting clearly enough by Rick.
Yeah.
But I think what you might want to do is, if there's a consensus amongst the planning board that this is a concern to the whole planning board, convey that and whatever feedback you have to the committee or the sponsors, if possible, in advance of the next meeting, so there can be some work done on their end to try to address those concerns or respond back. Otherwise, obviously there'll be another continuance without any progress. So I think it's a good point you raised, which is, that maybe this has gone beyond just a concern for just Rick, but the whole board. I don't know.
So one comment I had, I wasn't there at the earlier discussions, what you said a year or two ago, whatever, but probably a lot of the people were very supportive because I think they were thinking of it being owner occupied. So I wonder if it would vary based on the different categories we have. I think a lot of people would be pretty positive as far as, having the owner in residence there and there during the rental, as opposed to, a different type if the owner's not there.
Yeah, I think that needs to be absolutely clear. The other thing is the transient nature of the people who are coming in and into the neighborhood. It's not about the noise and the parking. This is what I've heard in the South End. People feel like their neighborhood is being watered down, the sense of living in a community, because there are so many people just walking around the neighborhood, coming and going, that are taking part in these short-term rentals. And that's the issue as much as controlling noise with a resident owner operator there. So that's something else to kind of keep in the back of our minds about permitting it everywhere in established neighborhoods.
And that I'm going back to the idea that maybe there's some threshold of how often they're doing this. I think that using that as sort of to help in definitions would help control some of the concerns that people have, because if they could only do it half of the time under this short-term rental unit, then the people living in those neighborhoods only have to worry about people being in there, you know, half as much as not 365 days, but 100 and whatever the threshold is. And then if you're above that, then you are a bed and breakfast and you do have to go through the special permit.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to restrict
I don't know.
people. And I also, you know, I guess just to counter what you're saying, Bonnie, and a lot of the people way back in the senior center, you know, they talked about the kinds of people who, you know, rented. They're not inexpensive. They're people who many times can't find. We don't have good hotels in town. We simply don't. We have a handful of inns, but also short-term rentals are a different lifestyle for vacationing or even for going on business. They just are. So I like to think of a lot of the people who are customers or enhance a neighborhood as they walk around. You know, it's only a very few stories you hear of, you know, loud, crazy parties with 20 people. I don't think that's the standard. And that's not what I'm hearing. And actually, when I listened to your recording on the public hearing last time, I was shocked that so few people made any comment at all. I don't know if it's a big deal for people. I mean, I don't know if it's a big negative deal for people.
Well, just imagine if people on both sides of you had short-term rentals and there were, you know, people coming and going all the time. Nice as they are, they don't live there all the time. Does that sort of fit in your category of being okay as well?
Well, I think the odds of occupancy on two sides of me is really unrealistic. But no, I don't think I'd mind.
I think it goes back to, Bonnie, you also could have a bad renter next to you, or you could have a bad, you know, there's
that I've had.
I know, you just don't know. And I think that that's where I think, you know, having some enforcement is going to be important. So I think that rather than just saying, no, we're not going to have them, I think that there are some benefits. And I agree with you, Anne. I remember hearing some positive comments before, and I've had a lot of positive experiences as well. So I think that that the licensing can be in place to sort of say, hey, you know what, this one's having a problem. This particular unit is having a problem, and let's crack down on that one. So I think you're probably going to find the negative cases you're going to hear more because they're clearly a problem, and I just don't want the negative cases to overshadow the fact that this could be a real positive for the city. And actually, I'm sorry, one more point that I actually had and that I was thinking about after the last meeting was I think it could be interesting, you know, for the city council to think about. It's not really for us to think about, but, you know, as we incur fees or as we talk about fees and we collect taxes for this, you know, I know that there's been a lot of talk about short-term rental units taking away housing from that could be affordable. And I think that this might be an option for us to to take the fees and whatnot that we collect and maybe designate them for the Affordable Housing Trust. Could be an interesting way to sort of help offset some of those issues.
Interesting.
Did we want to talk about anything that we haven't talked about, like parking, putting it into the zoning?
Yes.
I'm trying to make sure we cover all the topics before we sort of do a summary of what we might want to write up for the counselors in advance of the next meeting. Yeah,
Yes.
John, let's do the parking.
Okay. The reason I raised it at last meeting is my impression is if there are complaints, there will be complaints, either the noise, which we heard, and parking. And I think when I mentioned the thing about noise, they put the noise standard, they specifically said the city council, and they can always retract this or whatever, the crafters of this ordinance said, well, we wanted some type of zoning, we wanted some enforcement. In other words, with licensing, they did not have the enforcement vehicle for noise that they would in zoning. So I would say we should have the same thing with parking. And especially, Bonnie, you were referencing earlier in the South End. As you know, one of the biggest issues in the South End is parking. I mean, we hear it all the time, parking, parking, parking. And so it seems to me we should have something in the zoning ordinance for parking to be consistent with noise. Now, my argument is diminished if they take the noise out of the zoning that they put in there. But to me, for consistency, we should have both in there.
So to follow up on that, I found an appeals court case from not too long ago in Barnstable that overruled a licensing ordinance. It was actually a bylaw since it's a town, but not an ordinance. But it overruled it invalidated a licensing ordinance because the licensing ordinance controlled parking. And it said parking can only be controlled through the zoning ordinance. So I do think it's essential to have something in the zoning ordinance about parking. And what I suggested was a two-part thing. One, and this, of course, this kind of depended on my using a special permit. If we don't have a special permit, it doesn't work. But the first threshold was provide at least one off-street parking space, whether on the parcel or on another parcel, for each bedroom in the short-term rental. And then the second part is through the special permit process, if the zoning board determines that this is a parking could be a problem, the zoning board can require additional parking spaces or in different locations or something like that. So to have at least a threshold and then the ability to look at things on a case-by-case basis. You do need to have something. So just imagine this: if you have a 3-bedroom limited share unit, or even a 3-bedroom owner adjacent unit, it only requires 2 parking spaces under zoning, and your licensing cannot force you to have any more than that. So I think it really makes sense to require at least 3 parking spaces if you're renting it out to 3 people. That was just my thought.
So let me back that up with the wording that's more general in the licensing now, which if your case law is correct, it's going to have to come out anyway and go into zoning. It says off-street, on or off-site parking areas to accommodate all uses of the property, including the proposed short-term rental unit. So we could tack onto that 1 parking space per rental bedroom.
So what if everybody comes in one group?
I know. That's
again way too restrictive. The last 2 times I went to Quebec City and stayed in beautiful short-term rentals. And by the way, the owners were not present and I had no problems. I parked, and it was right in the agreement. There is no parking provided. I parked at public parking facilities and walked, and it was terrific. So I really don't want to super overregulate what has grown to be a nice organic business that really is great for a lot of people. I think that's overly restrictive again. And Bonnie, you know, we as a planning board may not have consensus on this. So we may not come to a simple single document that we all agree on. I think we're in different places on things.
And that's what I want to reflect in whatever we do write up for further consideration. Because I'm in a different place than you are. It's not about being restrictive. It's about preserving the neighborhoods where these are. I don't want all the spaces on Water Street in front of your house or on Smith Street in front of Don's and my houses to be taken up if they possibly could with, you know, even three more cars, let alone who knows how many more. So while we won't say where they have to park, I think we should say something about.
I agree, something, but I wouldn't say a space per bedroom. I
mean, that's what you're going to do is you're going to end up where you're going to end up having people carve out parking spaces in open space. And that's not what we want to see. I mean, I don't want to see the front yard of someplace tore up for a parking space because they want to do a short-term rental. I mean, that's just not.
But that's not allowed. How could they even do that?
I mean, they probably could. Couldn't they tear up their backyard to put a couple parking spaces if you're requiring it?
Yeah, but they have
to have a longer driveway, make a wider driveway where there might have been a garden. Yeah, I mean,
and still have the minimal amount of required open space.
You know, anyone downtown or in the north end, they can use the parking garage.
Yeah,
drop your bags off, park your car, and then the beautiful thing that everyone loves about Newburyport is it's a walking city.
Yeah, but how are you going to make that happen? You're saying these people have a good heart and they look around and they say, oh my God, we can't park here. That wouldn't be nice. So let's go park.
No, I'm saying you have parking in the zoning, but just let somebody be an owner and say to the people who are coming, you can't have your car in this neighborhood or there's no on-site parking, and figure something else out.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we're going to agree to disagree. I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm on the other side of the fence, and that's okay. I get it. And well, Bonnie will just have to write it up. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but personally, I at this point, I think my position is irretractable. So,
what is it, Don?
Pardon me?
What is your position?
The parking is what Rick said. It needs to be one per bedroom, and if you're not on street, if it's not on off street, it needs to be in some place in a public lot. They're not going to just park down the next street or something. And to even take it a step further to show that perhaps you think how radical maybe I am or whatever, Tanya, to take your point, I actually would rather have them put something in the air, some gravel in the backyard, than for them to take spots on a public street. And I will agree, the south end is in my opinion, horrific with parking. And I also agree, if I don't like it, I surely can move. So I also appreciate that fact.
Well, I also think that you're getting to a point that, I mean, because we keep hearing this, you know, over and over again in special permit applications and whatnot. And I think that maybe then the south end there needs to be then a different look at parking. You know, maybe you need to have parking passes. You know, maybe you need to look at like the Cambridge model. And in that case, then, you know, then you're not having people park on the street. So I think one space per bedroom is ridiculous. If I go to a house and I have my kids with me and my kids don't all have their own car, I mean, so you're saying that they would need three spaces?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of families use, and I would show up to a 4-bedroom and need one parking space.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also the opposite situation where the 3 bedrooms would be rented out to 3 different couples, and
Right.
then you need it. So if you haven't covered that, then your street gets backed up with parking. So
Or
maybe
you
the
Yeah. Or you just say that, you know, that the owner has to just say that there's no parking on site, and that there's one space, and they have to figure that out. And so that might be that then they have to put it, and they can say that it has to be, you know, parking accommodations have to happen in the garage or whatnot. But yeah.
could that be in the licensing? Even though parking isn't, even though that case law that Rick found said you couldn't have it in there, but it would be a part of your license
application
agreement that you just tell you and that would mean that it would be enforceable, because if neighbors complained that they couldn't get parking because they saw these short-term rental people parking where they normally would park in front of their house, that the
Yeah,
license
this is Andy. I agree. I think although Rick might be right in citing limited case law, I do think that the licensing commission would have authority, and it would be appropriate to allow the licensing commission some authority to review the parking situation on a case-by-case scenario and impose conditions, and then obviously pull licenses if parking becomes an issue.
Well, I guess what I would say is you would have to delete the provision that you have right now in the licensing draft. Because what you have in the licensing draft is actually a zoning regulation. So you could say that the licensing board can make determinations as part of its determination, can reject an application because it has concerns about parking. But I don't think you can say what's in there right now, which is actually a zoning regulation. I can't find it immediately, but it's
under applications in 9-306, 8.3.
Yes.
B8.3.
That's the one that's actually a zoning regulation.
Yep.
And so you'd have to delete this and then have one of the, and I don't mind deleting this. You just can't have it in the licensing agreement, and have something that's vaguer that says, or more flexible, that says, as part of the review, the licensing board must find that there is not going to be a parking problem, or may require certain provisions for parking.
And that goes into licensing, and there's nothing goes into zoning under that.
So under zoning, all you need to have is 2 parking spaces for the single family residence, or four if you've got 2 dwellings in the lot, or 3 or whatever it is. So that's fine as long as you take out the zoning regulation out of the licensing ordinance. It's not a problem. But then you're basically people coming in don't know. You know, they won't know whether there's a chance of them getting approval. Remember, the licensing board here is acting like a special permit authority. They have the same they have probably more flexibility than the special permit granting authority.
I agree, Rick. The only exception, again, I would take is the comment made by the council is that they liked the noise in the zoning because they have basically a way to enforce the ordinance. It's unclear to me how you enforce the ordinance, but for police action, et cetera, I'm not sure about that. So I guess that's why they put noise in there, right?
Well, you could just cancel the license.
Well, they could have done the same thing with the noise. They didn't.
Yeah. Right. No,
I'm just talking about consistency right now, but
yeah,
I get it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure noise should be in there, back to Don's point. It just seems kind of random. I don't remember, you know, other than Jim saying, hey, we wanted to emphasize it. Well, there are a dozen things you could have emphasized. You just chose that one. From a consistency point of view, I'm with Don. Take it out if it's going to be covered. You know, it's covered in the licensing around enforcement.
It's also covered in the zoning because there's the general performance standards in the zoning.
Right. Yeah. So I think we should just recommend that be pulled out.
Yeah.
Because looks like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
Going back to parking for a moment, to summarize, I would be okay with what Rick said about 2 parking space per single residence. Again, here in the South End, there's many residents that don't even have a parking spot. So at least to me, that's a minimum standard. And if there's some incremental requirement they want to do, whatever it may be, they could do that through the licensing, assuming that would be okay by case law, Rick, or by law, I don't know, or Andy.
And that's standard. I mean, we know that already. So
Right.
that's in the zoning ordinance anyway. So we can, I think we've put to bed the parking and the noise regulation.
How do you, well, I'm not sure you.
That's why, that's why I brought it up. I want to make sure you understand, or I understand you.
So I'm going to take my house, or we're going to take the house at the corner or something that has no parking spots, and they're going to do a B&B. And so what you're saying.
Short-term rental, you mean? Short-term
rental unit, part of a short-term rental unit. And so what we're going to do is the licensing. We're relying on the licensing board to say there's a single residence. It's supposed to have 2 parking spots. It has no parking spots. So therefore, we're going to deny your permit, or you're going to have a requirement, God knows how they're going to enforce it, to have the people that use your short-term rental unit to park off street somewhere. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, that would make sense to me.
Because that builds on what Rick was saying about removing the current language about parking from the licensing ordinance and add a more flexible statement that allows them to enforce parking if it becomes a problem based on the fact that you're only allowed to have, you're required to have at least 2 parking spaces per residential unit. If I got that right, Rick, while you're making notes.
Yeah, you do. But the point is that Don said is that many houses don't have 2 spaces. They're non-compliant with the existing, they're non-conforming, I should say, to the existing zoning ordinance, and they're legal non-conforming uses because they were in that situation before the zoning was adopted. So what happens if somebody comes in and wants to do a accessory limited share bedrooms on a regular, conforming to the zoning? I don't know whether they're still non-conforming to the zoning or whether they now have to comply with the new use because it's a new use, whether they have to comply with the zoning because it's a new use. I don't know.
Isn't that normal that if you have a new use, you have to comply with the
I would think
requirements
so.
to that use?
I would think so.
So they wouldn't be allowed to have one, quite is the short answer.
Yeah. But I guess the question is, does that have to be spelled out in the ordinance just so it's not ambiguous? But that could be part of the licensing ordinance also.
You know, this was brought up by somebody from the public, and I didn't quite understand what he meant, but he said, you're not dealing with existing nonconformities. And here's a good example of it. And you're saying that ought to go into licensing because it has to do with parking in particular? Are there other nonconforming issues that might come up that we should cover in zoning?
I think the point that the person was making, I might be wrong about this, but I think the point that the person was making was short-term rentals right now are illegal, and therefore they're not protected as legal non-conforming uses. Oh. And so I think that was what the issue was.
So we're fixing that with all these amendments.
By adding short-term rentals as an allowable use, we would be solving that problem to a certain extent, yes.
Yeah, okay. So the latest question is about adding some statement about non-conforming parking situations.
Yep.
You're making a lot of notes. I hope this is toward some sort of a draft statement that will cover our various points of view.
So one question, just as we're going forward here. I guess I'm wondering, we are keeping the requirement about the residing no fewer than 183 days of every calendar year in the dwelling as part of the short-term rental definition?
That's in the licensing though, I think, isn't it?
It's under the requirements, number 3 of the zoning one.
Oh.
Right there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and 3A.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has 32 days plus the 183.
Yeah. Yeah, I just was thinking about that. I just wanted us to consider a situation where someone has a house in Florida and they become a legal resident of Florida, but come up here in the summer to their house. And then if that's the case, what we're saying with that is that they wouldn't be allowed to have short-term rental units in their house up here in the summer because they don't meet the 183 days, even if they're up here for 5 months in the summer.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is for residents. That's
Yep.
part of the underlying policy, I guess you'd call it.
Right,
Controlling
policy.
all of this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It raises a good point. What if somebody does go down to Florida and they want to rent out their place as a winter rental? They wouldn't be allowed to do it if their legal residence was in Florida. They would have to maintain their legal residence in Newburyport.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't be a short-term rental, it'd be a long-term rental.
That's true.
Unless they want to do multiple short-term rentals to make more money.
Yeah, no, it'd be a long-term rental.
Yeah, in winter, that's not going to happen. So, except, few exceptions. I think we're ready to wrap this up, but we need to have a direction going forward. It doesn't look like we're going to have proposed change of language that everybody can live with in the zoning ordinance. So maybe we take up Andy's idea that we summarize or incorporate the different points of view as still outstanding issues for further consideration with the counselors. Because as somebody pointed out, I think it was Ann, even if we did come up with a relatively clean zoning proposal, there's no guarantee that they would accept it anyway. So there's no point in I mean, if we don't, we could, but I mean, we don't need to tie ourselves in knots to come to some sort of consensus, especially as it doesn't look like we're going to be able to. I like the idea of clearly laying out the issues we have where we haven't been able to agree and then where we have been able to agree, both in the zoning and some licensing changes.
Yeah, Bonnie, I like that idea because it's one of the concerns I've had with an ordinance like this or in other ordinances like it, is that it's preferable if we can all come to some sort of consensus, planning board, city council, and others, about what the requirements will be, in concept first, and then draft language accordingly, rather than going around in circles on language without having any kind of consensus about a direction.
Well, I'm saying we don't even have consensus because some people want special permits and some people want permitted everywhere with very little regulation. So I think the first step is to write up what we see as the different perspectives, and then see if we can't pull that together to a more coherent, if we want to spend some more time on this at the next meeting, if we will be allowed to at least have that summary and have it shared with people, but not have any discussion until we see each other again in 2 weeks, and then make what turns out to be our latest version of our recommendations to the council for consideration at the joint public hearing. do it in 2 steps. I think if we do continue it as drafts and draft discussion points, we get into less trouble with ourselves and with other people than trying to make it look like this is what we want to kind of push going forward. The question is, what's the best way to incorporate everybody's views without deliberating offline between now and the next time we look at this together, hopefully our next meeting? Anybody have any advice on that? Oh, I got an idea. Sometimes it helps just to say it out loud, sorry. What if we all sent our various positions, not more questions, but positions or things that we want to see happen in the zoning and where relevant and the licensing as it relates to zoning to Andy, and that the staff pull that all together for a working document that we review on September 16th.
This is Andy. I'm not necessarily convinced that that's realistic based on the number of and types of concerns that people have, for us to be the point people trying to summarize or whittle that down into a bullet list that can be shared with others. I think it's probably better coming from planning board members where there's some sort of, you know, agreement on that content.
Yeah, but we can't. Are you suggesting that one of us be the one who receives all that but doesn't discuss it with anybody and is responsible for just collating it into one document for review?
Well, so previously there was a working group where both you, Bonnie, and Rick were part of that discussion with the sponsoring counselors. To me, it seems like perhaps you and Rick could work together, since you've been involved from the beginning and have some particular thoughts on this, that, you know, as chair and the most active member involved in the discussions about this, that you could help to summarize where you think the board is on this, and also the opinions that might be, you know, dissenting opinions or whatnot, to make sure that's adequately covered in there. And that be a way of doing that between the meetings. That's not a quorum of the board.
Okay. Would we be allowed to have that attached to the staff report for review for the next meeting?
Yeah, if you send that over to us, we can attach it to the staff report.
Are we allowed to solicit input from our colleagues before we put this together, just to make sure we've covered everybody's views?
Well, my assumption here is that you're trying to capture what you've heard this evening. If you're looking for further dialogue with that, to me, that seems like something
not further, just what, as I said at the opening of this, any idea that is presented tonight is the only thing that can be used going forward until we have our next public hearings. So any ideas that people put out tonight to ensure that they get incorporated into this summary document that we're going to review at the next meeting, would it be okay if they sent their comments to us?
I can't say that, because I think that would result in some sort of deliberation of the entire board outside the public hearing. So again, I think we have a recording of this meeting that the board, you and Rick, would be able to go back to if you wanted to try to capture everything that's been discussed tonight in there. But I don't know how to get around the issue that you're talking about, which is, you know, how does the board have a deliberation outside the public forum?
Okay, I can live with that, because we're going to have another opportunity, and it'll help us focus our discussion on the 16th.
Yep.
And that'll be a time to clean it up, or to clarify, or to add anything. But at least we'll have something in front of us that we can go through point by point. Would that work?
Would work.
All right, Rick, I guess we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah,
I'll start an outline and I'll send it to you, and we can build on it from there.
Oh, I like that idea a lot.
okay.
Bonnie?
Yes, Anne.
Could I ask a question? I'm just wondering, is there consensus among us on the thinking that we need better clarity on definitions of bed and breakfast, short-term rentals, and lodging, if we even need lodging anymore?
Yep.
Do we all agree on that? That
yes.
clarity would be important?
We may not be able to make it happen, but the bed
Yeah.
and breakfast and the lodging, but that could be part of our, that's definitely what we all agreed was a sticking point.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So that's one thing we agree on.
Whew.
Yeah,
I like to stop on a positive
You
note.
may be the only one, but anyway.
Nobody else can talk. That's it. Ann's got the final say.
yeah. I was just wondering, as long as will Rick's breakout be included in the thing that's pulled together that will be presented at the next meeting, where he separated out the separate categories?
If we saw it tonight, it can be included.
Yeah, I saw it up on the screen.
Okay.
That's it. Okay, it can be included. Anything you saw or heard tonight can be included in that. We just can't take anything new or anything that's been shared, you know, one-on-one or one-on-two or whatever.
Yeah, I would like to see that as part of the discussion, so that's good.
Okay. Anybody else want to help Rick and me to right now with your comments? Okay. Yeah, thanks, guys. And Andy. But it's a good solution. We'll do what we can. So that's short-term rental units. Tanya and Don, do you have anything on 6C and your thoughts on how we might craft a standard or a criteria for benefits?
May I yield the floor to the Honorable Ms. Tanya Hartford?
I'm falling asleep over here. I would say that yes, we have done some research. Don and I have looked at a couple ordinances. We've talked to some people throughout the state. There's not quite an ordinance that's similar to ours that we've found that's something, you know, apples to apples. But you know, we've talked to a few different planners about it. I think I was talking to the planner in Andover today, because one of the attorneys I talked to said that they had an ordinance that that had historic preservation as sort of a goal, and so they allow a special permit for dimensional. So they allow sort of some dimensional relief to preserve historic homes and allow other units through an A&R. So that's the closest we could find. But I think that what Don and I have come down to is that I think that our task was what would be that if we wanted to charge some type of fee or some type, you know, charge, like what would that be? And I think last time we talked, it was something around 5% of the assessed value was what was being tossed around. And one of the things that we found that was kind of interesting was looking at it not on the assessed value, but more on the additional square footage that's being added in the new residential unit, and tying the fee to a cost per square foot. So so that might maybe limit the size of the second residential unit or home that's being put on the site, and then also would maybe yield some funding for the CPA or the Affordable Housing Trust. So we are throwing around, I think when Don and I last talked this afternoon, we were thinking somewhere around $10 a square foot. You figure if the average home that's being built is somewhere around 2,500 square feet or higher, you know, you're getting $25,000 into one of these funds as if you were to opt to build a second single family home on a lot. The preservation restriction would still be in there. I think we had that in there anyway. So I had made some changes to the zoning ordinance, some line edits, but we thought we would chat about it today and see if you guys want some more information or if this seemed like a plausible idea. So I'll open the floor for discussion.
So Tanya, the benefit would be a financial one to our community.
That's right.
Okay.
And a question, as far as the preservation of historical structures component of that, does that only apply where the existing house on the lot is of historic significance?
That's right. Mm-hmm. So we would want to encourage that first. And I think that sort of struck me as being important, especially in talking to Andover today, and that one of their issues was that people would just tear down the existing house and because they could build to, you know, more units or bigger units or more, you know, efficient units by having multiple houses on a lot. So we would say first and foremost, you know, you need to, in order to get a 6C, you need to preserve the historic house, and 2 is, you know, you would have to have a benefit to the, provide a benefit to the town in the form of financial contribution to the community preservation trust, the CPA fund, or that would be my recommendation. But we also could do the affordable housing trust, and it would be, right now we were setting it at $10 a square foot for the second residential unit or second residential home. And that would be at the payment that would be at the time of the, I think, of the building permit being issued.
Mm-hmm. And just one other part of that is, how is that determined as far as the historical significance?
I think actually, Rick, we had that, you had that in the ordinance, that was something we had agreed to, right, in the last go around of this iteration. So Don and I actually weren't even reviewing that piece of it. So. Yeah,
I think it was, I don't even remember what we had as wording, but we were just assuming that it was, oh, I guess it was a contributing structure. Is that what it was?
It was. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was something along that line. And then we would just require a preservation restriction. So just like it is now, they would just go to the Historic Commission and they would say that there's some historic significance in saving that structure. And so that would be one of those requirements. So.
Okay, because in the initial draft that he sent out, there wasn't anything about that.
Right.
But it was only through discussion at the meeting.
Yeah, actually, I had a draft from July 29th that says a permanent preservation restriction. Well, that was a bullet point. Permanent preservation restriction on any existing building determined to be historically significant, approved by the Historic Commission. So I guess this determination, this probably goes through the whole National Register District inventory process.
I have maybe a complicating factor, and you don't want to consider it, but I like the idea of the cost per square foot formula for a general benefit to the city if it's going to go to the CPA fund. But if we really wanted to do something for a contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust, and I'm going to make an argument for that, because although we never really could get much out of a 6C for affordable housing, I think many of us have talked about affordable housing being an issue in the city, and if we could find some funding for it, whether it supports the current rental support program or something else that the trust is overseeing, or went into a kitty to eventually create an affordable unit, it would go some way toward benefiting the city on that score. And if we were to do that, it seems to me we ought to have some other way of calculating the fee. And several communities that I've seen do something to do with the difference between the fair market value of a unit and the price of producing an affordable unit at that time. So you don't have a standard lump sum, but rather it's according to what the value is at that time. And that amount would be then donated to the Affordable Housing Trust. And I don't know if we would want to have one or the other of these options, or put both of them in there and allow the applicant to decide which one is, I suppose, more advantageous to them.
Don had done some research on this. Don, you have some feedback on the affordable housing. Yeah,
we took a look at, and one specifically was the city of Northampton, Bonnie. And you can work out all the numbers as you suggest. And it probably does come out to be a little bit more than the $10, but I guess, Tanya and I like the simplicity of it. When you look at least the one in Northampton, I forget the other one I looked at, you've got to do some math, you got to look at indices, whatever. This was pretty straightforward, and I guess if you want to do an inflation adjustment, you could throw that in there every year, whatever. But I kind of liked it, and I think Tanya liked the simplicity of it. And
I like the simplicity, and I also think where you're coming down on the number is very reasonable. I think your formula, Bonnie, would create a much higher cost, and I don't know if that's reasonable. I do like your idea about maybe thinking of dedicating funding to the housing trust. If you give it to CPA, CPA historically has supported a lot of open space and still does through bond issues. I personally don't think we need any more. And the city also grabs a lot of CPA money for things that aren't covered by taxes, like school and city hall improvements, things like that. So I would just second us really thinking about that, the housing trust. Over and over again, the cry in the city is that's who's being left out.
My thought on that, I just wondered, you talked about having separate funding and so forth, and I was wondering why limit it to 6C type situations, and why not propose, like some communities do, having like a land bank fee on anytime a house is sold, putting a contribution, and have that go towards affordable housing instead of just targeting the 6C.
Well, I guess to answer your question, Alden, yeah, I guess you're right. You could use the verb targeting, but because we were looking at 6C, we were just trying to take that bite of the apple first. Your point's well taken. Perhaps the other difference is many of these other items were a special permit, because I actually thought about this myself. You bring up a great point. Well, but we have other special permits, but the special permit allows you to build something by right. It's not necessarily enlarging something, whereas I in my own mind, I was differentiating something with the 6C. And it may be an obtuse point, but again, going back to what we were asked to do was specifically look at the 6C. I mean, I think you're bringing up a more broader question. It's appropriate, but again, that's where it goes. And I think to Ann, and I would, Tanya, I haven't really discussed budget, but I would agree with Ann and Bonnie. And I even think it even has more quote political support, whatever that means, to throw it in the affordable trust. That's like, arguing about motherhood and apple pie, whereas you're right, going to the community preservation committee, you're right, we fund all types of things.
I was just trying to, I think that there was somebody had brought up that, open space is still important, and that was part of this ordinance, and we were clearly covering preservation, and we were clearly covering affordable housing if we put it to the affordable housing trust. But we just wanted to make sure we weren't dropping out open space. And so I guess we could add something in there if we felt like that was still important and a key, or but really to me it's one, I'm torn. I think it would be great either way. I also think, this is really a policy decision that's going to go before the city council, and certainly we can make a recommendation, but I think that's something they're going to come back and recommend sort of where they think it's most appropriate to go. But the cost per square foot, the other item that I thought was appealing to that was just that we would possibly get a smaller home, where I think that if we tie it to some other market value, that the inclination would be to create a larger home to make up for the profit that they might be losing because they have to pay this fee. So I think that this might have the benefit of, one, creating a smaller structure, and then two, providing some funding as well.
Yes, my feeling on this is I agree with you on that, on the square foot, but I do also agree with Bonnie on trying to keep this targeted to housing, because when you take a situation of it, turning a two-family house into a single family and adding another single family, what you're basically doing is raising the total cost of housing of those two units. So I think that a contribution to an affordable housing trust fund is a more direct connection to what's happening in terms of the impact on the community. So
yeah, no, I agree. So I would support that wholeheartedly.
Wow. Anyone else want to chime in on this? Okay.
I think you've done a great job. That's wonderful. Terrific.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So we're not supposed to craft any language. We can hand this over to staff, Andy, and you can create a draft ordinance with what we've done in the past and what you've heard tonight.
Yeah, Caitlin and I can have a discussion about that internally and circle back with you with the draft.
Actually, you know, Andy, I think Rick had a draft, right? Rick, and you had actually added some language in, and I just updated that. I can send that over to you.
That'd be great.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, is that allowed? I'm assuming it is.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just send you the track change. I sent it to Don earlier, so we were kind of, so I'll send it to you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wrap that one up. You guys are great, really. We know who to delegate to the next time. Thank you.
I just
Tanya did all the work. Tanya did all the work.
No, Don, you did a lot of calls. I enjoyed the conversations I got to have with Don.
Good, that's the whole point. These side conversations.
That's right.
I can't even find the agenda. I think there was something on there for an update from Andy. Did you have something? Yeah. You wanted to talk to us about remote meetings?
Yes, thank you. So Bonnie and I had a discussion about this a couple of days ago, but the council's had at recent meetings, a committee meeting, a couple of committee meetings, and their regular meeting, they have discussed their own policy for meeting in person versus the remote situation we have right now because of COVID. They've had some discussion, and then it resulted in essentially an agreement that they would try a hybrid process where they try to allow at least counselors to meet in person who were interested in doing so or able to, and some members of the public, if possible, in the room as well. I'm not sure how meaningful that result will be right now, only because there's a 25-person cap on these gatherings. And so, you know, that's going to be exceeded pretty quickly with the council members, staff, and a few members of the public, especially this is where it becomes interesting. The committee and the council originally had a draft from Councilor Z recommending that the other boards of the city also try to meet in person. And obviously we as staff wanted to know where each of the boards are in this. We have some sense from the Conservation Commission, they're comfortable with the remote meetings right now, but not knowing where the numbers of COVID-19 are going to go in the coming weeks or months, you know, hearing about a potential increase in the fall, you know, I think a lot of people seem to sort of prefer to just kind of stick with the status quo right now and see where it goes in the next couple of weeks or months. But bottom line, I guess, is that the committee and the council took out the recommendation for other boards as to what the other boards do. And Councilor Agaman had made that suggestion that it be removed, recognizing that the other boards, your board in particular, for instance, and the ZBA should decide for themselves what you feel comfortable with doing. So obviously would like a sense of where you stand on that. But two, the other issue that I pointed out was the final version of that order that was approved by the council. Heather Shand, who is the Planning and Development Committee chair, raised this concern at the council meeting on Monday night, which was that the order adopted by the council, again, for its own meetings, also calls for its own subcommittees, which includes the Planning and Development Committee of the City Council, which is the 3 members that meet with you for zoning changes, that those meetings, that they should be following the hybrid policy, meaning the committee of the Planning and Development Committee, the 3 members of the council, should be trying to meet in person in the council chambers at City Hall or the auditorium or whatever room is deemed appropriate. So Heather Shand had asked that clarification on the floor, and Councilor Agaman noted in the record that you know, the city council can't compel other boards to, you know, to meet in person if they're not ready to do so, and so forth. But you know, one, I wanted to bring it to your attention that there has been some discussion about not only the council's meeting process during COVID, but also other boards. And two, just kind of flag it for you that with respect to the zoning hearings, if there's discussion about the short-term rental units hearing or other ones like it on zoning, we'll need to know where you stand on meeting in person, because it sounds like at least some of the council members and the council committees may be going in that direction. You know, and so we would just need to see if that aligns with where the planning board is on this. Obviously, we've been able to make the Zoom process work for zoning and public hearings so far. So I welcome any feedback if any of you have thoughts on the meeting setup.
Yeah, Andy, to me, if it's hybrid, it's I don't understand the debate. Maybe the city council is because they'll be viewed politically when they go the next time that they're not there in person. But personally, you guys can have a hybrid and I'll continue to do what I'm doing. You know, so that's my view of it. So I could understand the city council maybe is a little bit different.
Yeah, well, I do think there's a bit
but
of
I'm not
a
going to
sort
go
of
in person. So I'll take the other extreme. If I have to be in person, I'll tender my resignation. And I know that that's not the extreme, but the hybrid, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate that. Yeah. The one thing I didn't mention, which it was also a concern to me in terms of actually making this realistically happen, is if there's a cap on 25 people being in the room and you subtract the council members and staff that might be there during any of these meetings. And again, if the planning board's meeting jointly with them, or even if it's one of your regular meetings and you want to meet in person, if that cap is still there or some other threshold is a requirement, and we get people who come to the door, the policy that the council adopted basically says it's a first come, first serve. So I could envision, certainly with our zoning hearings or the Institution for Savings hearing or other things more of interest to the public, that we could get people coming down to City Hall for a meeting, finding out they cannot get in the room because of the cap under COVID, being told to leave and go home to their computers to connect remotely, and being somewhat frustrated because it wasn't clear whether or not they'd be able to get in the building or not. So to me, that seems like we're just sort of rife for problems, I think, if we don't, think about the consequences of doing it and not having enough capacity for people when we're meeting.
Andy, there's another thing I want to raise about this. And as background, I've been every alternate Wednesday, I'm actually at a different planning board, which does hybrid meetings. And it works for them, but it works because the technology and staff resources are different. And in particular, the planning director does not have to do anything in terms of managing meeting participants and so forth. There's a separate person from the cable TV station who runs all of that and sets up the queue for people to talk. I've been involved in a project that's been going on for 2 years in public hearings, and it is more controversial than the Institution for Savings. And we found that people are very happy to sit at home and participate via Zoom. So what they do is they have 4 members of the planning board and the planning director in the hearing room. A couple people come and participate in person, but 95% of the people who participate from home. Another challenge when you're thinking about hybrid is how you present the information. If an engineer wants to come and present in person, how does that work with combining the audience in the room and the planning board members who are there and the people on Zoom? So it's more complicated for a planning board than it is for a city council because you've got these plans to look at and so forth. So it works if you have the resources, but it would take a lot more planning to get us there. And I'm with Don. I would stay home.
Thank you. Yeah, Rick, you're correct in noting, the meetings that we do on Zoom do take a little bit of preparation from Caitlin and I. We obviously have to have all the documents ready to go. We have to be able to monitor the public participation and comment periods. So it does take a little bit of preparation. There has been discussion about adding additional equipment at City Hall, the senior center, for this type of thing to kind of automate some of it. But I agree, there's definitely got to be a staff component to that too.
Yeah, this is Tanya. I think I feel as if, and I said this at the Institute of Savings hearing, we are getting a lot more. In some ways, you get more public participation when people can call in from home. So I think that works. I think it could cause confusion by having a hybrid model to some degree, but because people again wouldn't necessarily know when they can come in, or is it better to come in or not. So I think that until the COVID restrictions are lifted, I would just assume us continue to meet on like this, or some platform like this.
Yeah, this is Beth. I tend to agree. I think this seems to be working okay for most matters that we have. I do get nervous about the Zoom for the ones that there's more public interest in. I just worry that there are some people who can't participate in this fashion, you know, don't have the technology or whatnot. So that's my only concern, but I do agree that it would be a problem to tell people that they can come to City Hall, and I'm not sure that people would anyways, just because of COVID. You know, hopefully they can get access to the technology, or they can write letters, but it makes me nervous to think about approving a project or denying a project, making final decisions without being able to hold live hearings to some extent. But
yeah, I think Beth brings up a good point. Even if we did have a hybrid model and one or two of us wanted to show up at City Hall and we opened it to public comment, maybe the same people who don't have access or don't know how to use the technology are the same people who wouldn't want to come to a public meeting during the COVID period. So the only alternative is to put off a particular type of hearing until who knows when. And that's not realistic to keep things moving. So we have to live with a certain level of discomfort. I'm not sure what problem the hybrid model is solving. And like the others who have spoken so far, I think we're doing pretty good this way. And I'm prepared to continue doing it on Zoom until such time that it's safe for us to all meet together again with the public.
I think what I want to have Anne come over and sit beside me in my backyard while we do this. That would be perfect.
I would love to, Rick. I would love to. No, I agree with what everyone has said. And if I'm not ready to go out to a restaurant, I'm not ready to hang in a room with you people either.
Yeah, right. Even for Ratatouille.
Well, I don't know. In the backyard, maybe. Social distanced.
Yeah. So Andy, is there anyone else who'd like to comment on this now?
All right, well, thank you all. That's helpful feedback.
Okay. Is there anything else that anybody would like to update us on? Other than it's...
One thing, just quickly, tomorrow night, there is I've been trying to get the word out, but it's hard to get the word out. Merrimack Valley Planning Commission is having one of a series of virtual meetings to discuss their regional active transportation plan, which is all about biking and walking and so forth. They're doing a series of 5 regional meetings around the Merrimack Valley region. And so tomorrow night is the one for the coastal communities, Newburyport, Salisbury, Amesbury, and Newbury. And so if anybody is interested, email me and I'll send you the information.
Is your wife going to be there?
No, she's not. It's just a virtual meeting that they're doing.
No, I mean, will she listen in?
Yeah, I'm sure she will, yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'll tell you later.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Okay.
She's trying to get me to do that.
Can't be
Guys, enough.
Oh, that's not true.
You're going to share with everybody, or you're going to have this offline. We're getting a little too interested. Okay. Anything else from anybody? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second, Alden.
And roll call. Alden?
Yes.
Beth?
yes.
Anne?
Yes.
Tanya?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
Bonnie? Yes. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Night.
Right.